Okay, but the capitalist system as run by the state. The problem that the critique that I have is of the state, and I connect it to capitalism. Don't connect it to like make that argument, right? Just make the argument that it is indeed the state that is that capitalism is required to do that.
I can't, because if we look at the state in question, who owns this state? Who's controlling this state? Who actually is using the state in such a way for this to happen? And it's the same ruling class that got rich under the laissez-faire capitalism of the 1800s and the 1900s.
I'm not asking you to prove a negative, right? Like I'm asking you to prove a positive claim that you made. And the positive claim is that the destruction of wealth from the poor and the middle class and predatory system of mortgage crisis is an inevitability of capitalism. So prove that positive claim or back off of it.
I would say, in order to prove it, I would say there has been no example of capitalism that did not lead to this inevitably.
Okay, but that's just restating the claim. I'm asking you to prove the claim.
All right. So you said you had an opening statement, so I'll let you do that.
Oh yeah. So are you gonna cut your camera on or?
Nope.
All right, man. No chit chat. No.
I wasn't. Yeah.
Yeah. Of course, I want to see your face when I'm doing. Why would I want to debate a small little profile?
Stream.
Yeah, I'll wait. It's no big time. We're both streamers. We both go into the
advanced. I think on Streamlabs the problem is I have to do it before I go live, right? Or no, I can do it like this. Start virtual webcam. Okay. Video. Streamlabs virtual webcam. Okay. And then let me see how this works. All right, how's that?
Boom, there you go. Looking fucking beautiful. Dude, before we get started, look, we hate each other in terms of ideological positions, but like, can we just have a moment of peace before this begins and say, fuck cops? They have fucked up both of our evenings today.
Oh, yeah.
Yo, man.
I try to be as polite as possible because, I don't want to...
Because you're not trying to get shot?
Yeah, and I'm also not trying to get too bad of a ticket or anything like that, but yeah, pretty bad thing. The way I see it, you be polite to cops and they won't give you much trouble. And
yeah,
it's not very like principled, I guess, but it's like, whatever will allow you to move on with your day. I'm not trying to be a hero.
No, I mean, like, I wouldn't say that it's unprincipled to state that, like, tactically the most successful thing that you can do is not antagonize the mercenaries of the state, right? Like, that's not really the avenue to like make change. It's just a good way to get shot.
Right. Let me see. I'm trying to put your video online.
Just show.
Oh, I can do this. Okay, so this is. Thank you so much, Sleeper Cell. Appreciate you. This is like not working. I don't know why.
I mean, so long as you can see me, if like the audience doesn't want to fucking see me, they can, I'm sure they can catch the video later or something. It's not a big deal.
Yeah, we'll just proceed this way. So you can go ahead with your opening statement.
All right. So you want me to go first?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Yeah, sure. I'll just get right into it. Let me pause the music and let me just go forward. And then, yeah, this should clarify pretty well. So here we go. My opponent did not give a proposition for this debate and instead is defending the idea of communism in general. So I propose the proposition Communism is preferable to all other economic systems and political philosophies. Has obviously standing resolved. I will argue throughout this debate that both premises are false. Premise number one, communism is preferable to all other economic systems. For simplicity's sake, I'll be countering the idea of classical Marxism's desired outcomes in high communism via usage of low communism to capture the means of production, as well as the economic claims that make this preferable process to capitalism and liberty. Communist theory posits that capitalism exploits the laborer and the consumer. To solve this exploitation, the state must capture the means of production to avoid the inevitable pitfalls of capitalism and transition to a utopic anarchism devoid of inequality and private property. First, capitalism is not exploitative, communism is. Under capitalism, the worker has bodily autonomy and can freely contract with others for goods and services. Under communism, they do not have the right to do so. Second, the presumed collapse of capitalism based on the rate of profit falling is an imaginary cope. Humans are rational actors, using scarce means toward preferable outcomes. Humans live in a world of linear time. Humans prefer their goals to be achieved sooner rather than later. This is the universal time preference. Production requires land, labor, and capital. Even in the evenly rotating economy where perfect resource allocation has been achieved, which is impossible, by the way, profit is the capitalist's reward for capital investment to achieve man's universal time preference. The collapse of capitalism is not inevitable unless scarcity and resource allocation no longer exist, which is science fiction. Third, this is where communism falls both historically and in theory. A low communist state that has seized the means of production cannot compete with a free market economy. It's not possible, which is to say nothing of the authoritarian nature of enslaving its own people. Central planners never can and never will be able to solve the local knowledge problem or the economic calculation problem. They are faced with the impossible task of either wasting resources to gain knowledge of the cost of production or misappropriating resources for projects. They lack the billions of signals in a market that affect price as price is abolished. Premise number two, communism is preferable to all other philosophical systems. Communism is a conflict-endorsing system based on a Gnostic belief in the supremacy of power and class distinctions, the dialectic and material analysis. First, communism endorses and incentivizes conflict. The belief against private property is exactly this. When humans wish to utilize scarce resources for opposing means, there are only three possible outcomes. First, all parties but one voluntarily release their claims. Second, all parties involved begin argumentation to determine how the resources be utilized. If the first two options fail, then the third alternative is violence. Libertarianism asserts that there is one person with a legitimate claim to the property, and that one who uses violence against the property owner is an aggressor. Communism has no such solution. They claim property is owed by all, but property is scarce and cannot be utilized by all. Instead, they will use violence and enforcement mechanisms to ensure the poverty of liberty and wealth of all. Second, the supremacy of the Gnostic belief of power and class through an analysis is the knell of communists in accurately perceiving reality. To the Marxists, it must always be assumed that capitalism, capitalists' wealth, or lack of awakened, quote, critical consciousness, or, quote, materialism, is at fault for any suffering, conflict, etc. This poisons the truth. A great example of this is Engels in Socialism, Scientific, and Utopic. The first of 4 chapters tells his view of the recent history of Europe and the transition from feudalism into a more liberal society. Using historical materialism, the entire narrative is about the awakening of materialism in the populace at the destruction of nobility and the growth of the industrial bourgeoisie. He then proclaims the idea that the new elite must revive and support the growth of religion to control the workers. Surely, if atheism was allowed, then the proletariat would rise and establish the communist utopia. Of course, his theological analysis falls flat, failing to recognize the effects of the bubonic plague on workers' value, or that becoming materialists would somehow create ideas of socialism, because Marxist materialism sets aside non-material factors like culture, instead assuming that they need only be educated on their worldview and all else will be set aside. Well, I'm a materialist, and there's no one more materialist than the objectivists, and I don't see them or me denying property rights anytime soon. In short, the double premise, communism is preferable to all other economic systems and political philosophies, falls flat on both analysis of its claims and axioms. It is a contradictory economic system with a cult-like belief in the supremacy of capital and class. To reference Engels again, quote, everything must justify its existence before the judgment seat of reason or give up existence, and communism fails this test.
So, sorry, let me unmute myself. The stream. So, it's really my fault for not proposing a, I guess, a premise, but I don't want to obfuscate the debate too much, but I just kind of want to say I would like to clarify my position is not really about preference, because I think when we frame it in terms of preference, I think it gives rise to a level of like um, subjectivism, if that's the right word, that I don't
Mm,
think is compatible with the communist outlook. I don't think it's about preference. I think it's rather about necessity, right? So I'd like to argue for communism from the perspective of necessity rather than preference. And I don't mean to make it an interview. Just one question: do you think capitalism describes the system we live in right now?
no.
Yeah, I
I
kind of
think I
agree with
think I
you.
think the system we live in now is capitalistic. Just like certain actions that, like, I don't know, like Matt Walsh, or some of the anti-trans that go like hardcore might be like fascistic in culture. Just like certain things might be fascistic, but I wouldn't say in America we live under fascism, and I wouldn't say China lives under communism, and I wouldn't say that like America also or Sweden lives under capitalism. I think it has elements of the idea, but it's a mixed bag of bullshit.
Okay, well, I don't. So when I talk about communism, I'm talking about a very specific, let's call it a movement. Marx called it the real movement. And when I'm talking about capitalism, I'm talking about a mode of production. And then from my perspective, the capitalist mode of production is dead. That doesn't describe what we have. We don't have a free market. So to me, I guess my perspective is that it's not possible to have a free market because it gives rise to its opposite. And Engels described this in Socialism, Utopian, Scientific, the way in which competition gives rise to monopoly and the political implications this has. But to afford more philosophical consideration to what you were saying, I'd like to bring up a number of things. I don't think the institution of private property has anything to do with scarcity. And the reason I don't think it does is because, vaguely speaking, from what we know of the earliest forms of human society, in which scarcity was a much more relevant factor in everyday life, the institution of private property was either non-existent, or I know that's a contentious claim, but at the very least, I think most people can agree it was not really as developed as an institution as it would become later on in societies of much more abundance, right? The agricultural revolution led to the ability to store food in a much longer term and support a much larger population than before. So things like scarcity and, broadly speaking, the Malthusian view, I don't think are relevant in any discussion about economics. The threshold by which abundance and scarcity, sorry, the threshold by which resources become available to a population is not simply dependent on external and variable factors. It's mostly dependent on the factors of production, and those factors are historical, meaning they change. The carrying capacity of a given population changes. And if it was true that private property is necessary because of scarcity of resources, you would think that it would become less necessary as scarcity diminishes, but that the opposite is true, actually, for whatever odd reason. I'd also like to call into question the view that private property as an institution is even conceivable um, without something, kind of, to put it in your words, communistic, right? A singular universal state which establishes the recognition and right to property. Property is not only the way in which people own things in contradistinction to others, property also refers to the way in which the way people use and own things is given recognition externally by some third party. So when two individuals, as you used in your example, have an incompatible view of what to do with this objective thing, and according to you, this is the origin of private property, well, you neglect to mention that there has to be a third element, non reducible to the two actors, which is more or less the state. The state externalizes the object and the thing, Marx calls this alienation, I guess, and turns it into something that is not actually really belonging to the person in reality. It's only insofar as the thing is inscribed into some kind of collective ledger of recognition that we can speak of any kind of private property to begin with, which is why paradoxically Marx's critique of private property can also be understood as a critique of communism. It's not a critique of this really private, intimate, material sphere where people realize their individuality in contradistinction to others. It's really a critique of this abstract, formalistic universalism that gives external recognition to that and thereby alienates it from the real thing. In other words, private property is itself the antithesis of its real human kernel. It's the antithesis of this because it reduces this real kind of ownership, if you want to put it that way, to some kind of external, alienated form of recognition. And that's not this. I'm not making the anarcho-communist argument that, oh yeah, this means that capitalism, the state is responsible for private property. We should return to the stateless, pre civilizational, or I don't know if that's the right word, pre agrarian societies. I believe in an objectivity of the state, at least in some sense. And to me, the Marxist notion of the withering away of the state doesn't mean that it's going to become an anarchistic society. It means that the state will become superfluous. But the unity of humanity and the centrality represented by the state would probably remain in some form. But it wouldn't be in an alienated form. It would be in a form that is continually suspended in the intercourse of human production, relationships, and art and historical change and so on, rather than just this external abstract thing that's somehow not suspended in its own material premises. I know that sounds kind of like a lot of jibber jabber, but the main point, I guess, is that I don't necessarily think the state as such is an a priori bad thing. Now, regarding the economic calculation problem, I think most of the merit to the argument in favor of the economic calculation problem had to do with the growth of the information economy, the growth of the communications technologies, which paradoxically somehow also undermined the traditional form of capitalism as we know it. This Soviet communism and the early forms of communism, by early I mean in the 20th century, actually did quite an effective job at modernizing economies through standardized production. So steel production is very easy under a very strictly top-down planned economy because it's a standardized form of production. The expectation of what the society needs can be fulfilled by a plan because it's predictable, right? Because it's standardized. It's the same for everyone. It's easy to produce shirts for everyone as long as we say, okay, everyone's getting this specific one shirt, for example, and it's standardized. We know the light consumer goods industry, the light industries don't function in that way. Obviously, people tastes and wants and needs at the level of small goods varies tremendously, right? It's easy in a centrally planned way to just make rice for everyone, right, or make potatoes for everyone. When it comes to having an economy that can attend to the specific different cultural phenomena that emerge in a society, it can't be done in a top-down way. However, I call into question the notion that this requires private property. On the contrary, I think it's not private property that this requires, but decentralized information technologies, which I think markets have just become a proxy for, actually. Markets, rather than represent some kind of sovereign relationship between sovereign individuals, assume a derivative form, taking the form of signals, which the real institutions of capitalistic power, the financial institutions, use as a form of speculation. So I think even now we are witnessing a breakdown completely of the traditional form of capitalism. And although the veneer is there, underlying that veneer is this cybernetic, decentralized information economy, which simultaneously corresponds to an extreme level of centralization of the means of production. just not necessarily the methods of production. I know that sounds different. Means of production, referring to things like oil industries, energy industries, referring to things like steel production and railroads and things like that, infrastructure companies. But methods of production is more referring to the more ambiguous and multifarious ways in which that production can be fulfilled. Rather than the fundamental means of production, it's the method of production, which is subjected to the most kind of competitive and market pressures. But really what we're talking about is competitive social pressures, different degrees of popularity, different degrees of attention, different degrees of signals. For example, social media is already a form of this, which is not necessarily capitalistic. How many likes you get, how many views you get, is a form of measurement of social demand that does not necessarily take a monetary form, although it obviously is monetized. But I'll let you go ahead. And by the way, we don't have to have like these really long.
Yeah, no, they're opening statements.
Yeah, we could just kind of keep it conversational, I guess.
I mean, yeah. That was the frame of my critique of communism to start with. So I'm trying to understand your opening statement. The first thing that strikes me, right, that I want to pick apart is this idea that communism isn't an economic system per se, and it isn't a philosophy per se, but it is a movement. And so I guess I have to say, what the fuck does that mean when I'm trying to critique a system that makes economic claims that I think are wrong and makes philosophical claims that I think are wrong? And then it seems like you're distancing yourself from both the economic and philosophical claims in this idea of like, it's just a movement towards this. And I don't want to say that it sounds like, well, no, I will, right? I'll be a little bit of a dick. It just sounds like sophistry as opposed to sticking to actual claims that can be verifiable or not, or that we can go through logic trees. So what the hell do you mean when you say communism is a movement?
Sure, yeah.
To distance from those.
I just mean to say, as opposed to the idea that there's this diversity of possible systems we can have, and communism is just one of them. The Marxist view specifically is it's kind of an eschatological view that history is tending toward a specific direction, and the direction in which history is tending, communism, reveals something essential about the nature of history itself and the nature of humanity at large. So that's why Marx calls communism the riddle of history solved. So communism is not simply a claim about what a system we would prefer to have. It's also a claim of giving recognition to some kind of common social substance of humanity that is not reducible to the sum total.
But
now,
oh, go ahead. Sorry, but
really
if communism, it's like we're on Skype, we're delayed and interrupting. I'm sorry, finish, please.
Yeah, just real quick. So very recently we have this kind of individualistic view where the society, coming from the British, I guess, philosophy, is just a bunch of individual atoms. But before then, we can see that sociality and society is given form in a superstitious way, right? Whether that's through different kinds of religions, whether that's through some kind of mythology, this social substance has always kind of been given recognition in some way. And for Marx, communism is just this kind of abstract word for that. And he calls it scientific socialism because he wants to understand this in a scientific way, in a way that's conforms to a kind of standard of knowledge rather than superstition. But go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, so the problem, there's two major problems that I have with this form of argumentation. The first, and kind of like the glaring problem, is that like obviously communism, because of its axioms, breeds certain prescriptions, right? And so to say that like, oh well, it's just a movement, it's just waking up, it's just understanding, like it really seems like we're putting Marxist materialist dialectics and historical analysis, like historical materialism, in this nice little box, and everything else that communism is magically isn't, right? If this was like an academic field of like, like C. Wright Mills, right? The sociological imagination, right? Where he kind of makes this claim in the 50s that like sociologists should look at things from a structural functionalist position and a critical theory position, which is obviously kind of like Frankfurt's kind of bringing Marxist philosophy into cultural critique, right? Or Antonio Gramsci, if you will.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
or like looking at it from a dramaturgy, like if that's what communism was, right? I don't think you would see all of the other like there. It's obviously more than
No, no,
that. So like,
yeah, I think there's a misunderstanding. I'm fully saying that this includes the actual real experience of communism. So the Bolshevik Party, from its inception, the class struggle, Mao raising the Red Army in the 30s, the actual communist experience of communist states, to me, are all part of this, are fulfilling this kind of historical movement
right.
that I
And so when
referred
I
to.
when I hear that, right, when I hear that, what I'm really hearing is critical consciousness, right? Like from like pedagogy of the oppressed from Paulo Freire, right? In Brazil, re-educating the masses, and by doing
No,
so, teaching them literacy from a critical class conscious perspective,
no, no, no.
and that
I
like they're
think
waking up to this movement. But then with that comes these prescriptions, like what is your
no, no, no,
claim?
no, no. The
Go ahead.
context for communism is never itself communistic. So I don't think it's a criticism is something intellectual, I guess, theoretical. Criticism belongs to the realm of theory. When it comes to relating to the consciousness of the masses, the Marxist view is that class struggle, to quote Marx, communism is the real movement, and the premises of this movement are already in existence. So the actual struggle's already happening. The masses are already somehow um, orienting towards some goal, some ends, some struggle, right? The class struggle is already there. And there's already a primary contradiction in some kind of way before
What
there's any
contradiction?
communist consciousness.
Where is
So
the
for
contradiction?
example, yeah, so for example, the contradiction between the peasant agrarian mass and the landowners, right? That's not because of communism. It's not because of socialism. It's because of it's just like how MAGA, the contradiction between Trump and the what would you call the establishment, the sociological difference
Can
between
you
the coastal
can you
elites.
explain the contradiction from your analysis?
Yeah, so the contradiction lies in this way. So institutions have a very specific way of giving recognition to human beings. Institutions give recognition to social masses in a specific way. And that recognition covers the specific extent to which masses are treated, right? So institutions treat and, let's say, domesticate human beings according to a specific and necessarily limited historical standard. The problem with this is that there are necessarily those who not only stand outside of the threshold of the ability for those institutions to address, but actually premise the rep- reproduction of the institutions, which creates a kind of strange scenario in which you have a phenomena of this objective populism versus establishments. The establishment is referring to nothing more than a specific institutional paradigm. So
Okay,
that's an
hold on.
example.
Let me interrupt you. Let me
Yeah.
interrupt you for just a minute, right. Like I'm trying to understand. You're saying communism is needed because there is an inherent contradiction in, for example, the example you're seeming to allude to is right wing populism, and the idea that right wing populism is embedded within the institutions of the
No,
politics that are anti.
no, no, no.
Like what
The
is
right,
your argument as to why we need like make an
the
argument. Like there's
populism.
a lot of like
So
talking about
yeah,
how beautiful communism
right.
is and the
No,
awakening,
not
but
yet,
like
not yet.
give me an argument.
So the populism, whether it's right wing or something else, is a result of the majority of people not being given representation or recognition by the established institutions of society. And that's not because the people in those institutions aren't smart enough, it's because the very form of the institution is limited in its ability to, I don't want to use big words, interpolate individuals. And by interpolate individuals, I mean account for individuals. For example, the average American university obviously does not account for the average blue collar working class American, or these people in the Rust Belt, or and flyover America in these small towns. Obviously, no matter how much it will try to accommodate them, even if it wanted to, the very form of this accommodation is incompatible with their way of life. For example, political correctness. So this is just one example of the structural antagonism, the formal antagonism. Another one you can identify is in a
let's stick with one example.
Sure.
Right? Let's not bounce around. So you give an example. Communism is needed because the state apparatus of the post high school kind of academic colleges, technical
reigning,
schools aside, right?
All the reigning institutions of society. It's not just the university.
Yeah, but let's not get too meta, right? Let's stick with the example that you gave, right?
Sure.
So the example that you gave is that the academic institutions, as far as public and private, colleges and universities, they cast a wide net for a specific group of people, right? Which is mostly middle class individuals, and then of course some institutions are for the wealthy, that are using, state funds and resources to go to school, but they don't necessarily fit the cultural demands of every individual. How does that, right, correlate in any capacity as to why we need a prescription of communism when the prescriptions of communism don't seem to be anything that you're actually even sticking to? You're just talking about a movement of individuals waking up and analyzing systems and institutions that don't work for them.
No, and the analysis belongs to the realm of theory. When we're talking about the communistic practice of building a mass movement, we are just talking about, see, I mentioned universities as just an example of, you mentioned Gromsky, so maybe you're familiar with the term hegemony, okay? Mm-hmm. There's a specific hegemony.
It's a cultural hegemony. Upper education is a cultural hegemony.
It's not just a cultural one. It's also, and as a libertarian, I'm sure you're familiar with this, it's an economic and political one, and the two are entwined. It's in the form of, for example, monopoly capital, right? When private property aggregates in such a few hands, and the government becomes captured by this, the monopoly and the government work together to protect the monopoly. The government's in the hands of the ruling class. And then all of the institutions in the hegemony of society are built around this extremely narrow, the narrow interests of this ruling class. This obviously enters into contradiction with the great majority. So to be clear, the fundamental...
But pause, real quick. Yeah. But I would say the same thing, and we obviously have an almost polar opposite ideology, right? Like,
yeah,
so do you see what I'm saying? Like it doesn't connect with the idea of why we need communism. I can make the exact same argument you're making and say this is why we need anarcho-capitalism.
But the problem is that, from my perspective, anarcho-capitalism is just a utopia. It's a perfect idealization that could never be possible. Whereas communism, I think, is much more pragmatic in its ability.
How is communism more pragmatic? Like, what the hell do you mean by... Okay, pause. Let me back up. So when you say communism is more pragmatic and practical, how? Please explain how it is more pragmatic and practical.
The essence of communism is the ability to unite the overwhelming majority of the people in pursuit of some common interest using the power of the state, but not the existing state, but a new state power, right? After the state machinery has collapsed. So no ideal of statelessness gets in the way of the ability to actually recognize the need for, not only in the sense of a utility, but the state as the incarnation of a common interest. But the communist view recognizes the contradictions that the existence of state and the existence of any social form will entail and pose. And that's why the communist view is both centralization and decentralization. So, for example, if we want a freer market, By the way, I do want a freer market. I don't like monopolies. I don't want to just turn monopolies into organs of communist rule. I want to break them and have more free market, of course. But if we want that, then that's not possible without a land reform. That's not possible without expropriating the landowners. By landowners, I mean the monopolies, but in Bolshevik Russia, it was the landowners, or in Mao's China, it was the landowners. Expropriating these people who have aggregated all of these swaths of property in their own hands and redistributing them to the population. But here's the thing. Of course, as you would rightfully probably point out, such a redistribution could not be without conditions. It would happen according to the terms and premises of a common state and a common politics and a common power, really.
Okay.
And so I disagree with the view of a perfect anarcho-capitalist society of everyone having full sovereignty, living individually on plots and just trading. But I think we can actually get closer to that ideal through communism, but you would have to forego some kind of utopian view that there can be no state and that there can be no conditions. If there's conditions to property, of course, as you know, there's not really property anymore.
Okay, so there's a whole bunch of problems with what you stated. The first one that I can just do quickly is that libertarianism is not about each individual being a sovereign property owner in their own right. Like it is, right? But the idea behind anarcho-capitalism in a pragmatic reality is covenant communities and large swaths of land where individuals voluntarily choose to live under systems that likely would have state-like characteristics, but they're of their own voluntary choice. So, like an HOA, you move into a neighborhood, in order to buy property in the neighborhood, you recognize communally we're going to pay for the water, right? So you voluntarily take on those systems. You voluntarily choose the rules by which you live under. And if you don't fucking like it, you can go live in the middle of the fucking woods and no one will trade with you, get bent. Right. So first of all, like I think the idea of like purely stuck in theory and not talking about pragmatics gives people an idea of anarcho-capitalism or libertarianism that doesn't actually match like the literature that you might read from like Hans Hermann Hoppe or something. So I just want to that's just a correction, right? In terms of this idea of like utilizing the state, you snuck in a premise, which I think is something, well, I don't know if you snuck it in. It might just be naturally you talk about it, right? But you talk about the idea that it is somehow good or that it is somehow right or that we ought expropriate property and distribute it equally amongst all those that live. This is an extreme fundamental difference between what it is that you want and what I want. And this is a problem that I think is a violation of bodily autonomy and private property rights. I'll let you respond to that, but I think what's going to have to go is we're going to have to circle back to instantiating that private property right, because multiple times you've talked about private property rights as the observer, right? A and B dispute over a stick. C is the observer that establishes the order that facilitates this, this usage of property. And you say that C kind of requires a state apparatus. I would disagree on that, number one. And number two, I would say that it is not the state that has created private property. It is cultural institutions and individuals and the Enlightenment, et cetera, that have discovered an objective fact of natural law, which is that private property is a fact of logic and that to argue against it is a performative contradiction.
So the problem with private property in practice, though, is that we like private property when it's just referring to homesteads and it's just referring to individual forms of ownership. But we neglect to point out that it is in the very name of private property that, for example, government, more or less, how do you put it, banks abusing the power of the state gobble up individual private property, foreclose farms, and so on, and make this their property in a way that I think even you would have to admit is unjust. They use the power of the state as the source to acquire their property, not pure market mechanisms. It's clear that, for example,
I'm an
people who are
anarchist,
leading.
right? I would have the same critique of both communism and capitalism as economic
Yeah,
systems when they're
but
enforced by the state, because they're
but
not those things.
right, but you have to understand it's in the name of the right to private property that this is possible, because this kind of corruption, which is very subtle, it's not just like the state owns these banks directly and then it does this. Yeah, the
Yeah, I'm
banks will say,
interrupting.
yeah, it was a
Fraud's not capitalism, right? Like if just because people do things in the name of something else, right, isn't an inherent property of the thing they're
but
invoking.
here's the
It's fraud.
problem. The problem is that it's not actually fraudulent.
Okay, well, describe a scenario where people utilize private property rights as an excuse to violate private property rights, and this is the problem with private property rights. Like, it's a
Um,
silly critique as
yeah,
far as I'm concerned, but I want you
uh,
to go full blast,
sure,
and I'll shut
sure,
up.
sure. The predatory mortgage industries. You know, the whole thing surrounding the 2008 financial crisis that led people to lose their homes. Same thing going on with small farmers right now. Truckers who take out loans for their trucks, who can't pay those loans, who are basically serfs to the banks, and the whole form of enterprise of these banks, the way in which they get profit is by preying on these people. But the thing is, they wouldn't be able to do that if it was not for the support of the government and the way in which they're embedded with the institutions of the state. But
Y-
that's not
You're
really a
pointing
form of.
out things that libertarians were leading the charge on critiquing, right? Like you're pointing out the very
Yeah,
things that we are against and saying, see, but that's because it's exactly isn't private property, right? Like
but
fiat currency, quantitative easing,
yeah,
asset
but
inflation,
all of
all of
these
these things are a
things.
destruction of wealth of the poor and the
Right.
middle class caused by the state.
Sure, but my argument would be that was an inevitable result of the capitalist system.
Okay, but the capitalist system as run by the state. The problem that the critique that I have is of the state, and connect it to
Well, what
capitalism. Don't connect it to like make that argument, right? Just make the argument that it is
well,
indeed
what,
the state that is
no,
that
no,
capitalism
I can't.
is
I
required to
can't.
do that.
I can't, because if we look at the state in question, who owns this state? Who's controlling this state? Who actually is using the state in such a way for this to happen? And it's the same ruling class that got rich under the laissez-faire capitalism of the
But
1800s and the 1900s.
I'm not asking you to prove a negative, right? Like I'm asking you
Yeah.
to prove a positive claim that you made. And the positive claim is that the destruction of wealth from the poor and the middle class and predatory
Yeah.
system of mortgage crisis is an inevitability of capitalism. So prove
Yeah,
that positive claim or back off
I
of
would
it.
say in order to prove it, I would say there has been no example of capitalism that did not lead to this inevitably.
Okay, but that's just restating the claim. I'm asking you to prove the claim.
So you're
Just give me
saying
an argument.
you're saying the real capitalism has not existed, or what?
No, what I'm saying is you made a positive claim, and I'm asking you
Right.
to substantiate the
Okay.
claim, which is that this
So
process that you
yeah,
described, that libertarians were championing during, that we are the 99%. It was,
yeah.
Reason and Cato, the Prague. Oh, sorry, you're on kick. Can I say whatever? Prague.
Anything you want.
The
Literally.
Prague
Yeah,
were
yeah,
championing this shit. It wasn't like the based
yeah.
Mises caucus per se, but nevertheless, it was libertarians that were leading the charge and critiquing this as not capitalism, as wrong, and as the state interfering. And you're saying, well, this is inevitable
So to
in
clarify,
capitalism. So back that up.
my perspective, my view is that while I agree with I know about Ron Paul and all this stuff, but I
Yeah.
think I have the same critique of them that Engels and Marx had of the utopian socialists, which is that although they correctly diagnose the problem and they see the problem better than leftists most of the time, by the way, the proposed solution is a utopian solution. That notion of capitalism is a ideal system. It's something that has it ever existed in your view?
I would say
I don't
it
want to make this
probably
assumption.
only. I would say it probably only existed in some small communities, right? Not large of scale. Probably like the Republic of Kospaya from 1440 to 1826, I believe, was
Uh-huh.
probably the closest thing we've had to like genuine free market capitalism.
So
Yeah.
but shouldn't you evaluate the factors that led to the dissolution of the pure capitalism as maybe an indictment on the long-term sustainability and viability of that system?
I mean, sure, it fell apart, much like the Icelandic Tane system, right? Because individuals voted in larger powers. But I mean,
Right.
I think nearly 400 years lasting is a pretty good record. But of course, it's a small community. Um, I'm working off of axioms and first principles, right? I think I think a lot of times what we do when we discuss these things, especially you know, especially left wingers, more like dem socks and communists. I think once you get to the ancoms, they tend to go back to axioms and first principles again. I think you get this problem of like this post hoc ergo propter hoc, right? Which is that like we look at a situation, be it USSR, be it America, be it this place, and then we go, okay, here's 50 years of history. Here's what occurred, at the end of that, and here's the characteristics. Therefore, the characteristics led to this, and it's a fallacy to look at history and to be able to isolate variables throughout history to draw conclusions and causes. I mean, we can get an idea, we can guess, but to establish it as like empiric evidence as to the proof of one economic system or another is it's just a logical fallacy. It doesn't work. This is why you kind of have to work at it from a
But
praxeological position.
I think I don't I don't want to straw man you, but it kind of sounds like what you're kind of have, maybe you don't like the word, but it sounds kind of like rationalistic, where you're basically saying we can build any system we want as long as it obeys the proper principles of reason in our head. The real material practice and experience of history doesn't matter. And I kind of just fundamentally disagree with that view.
No,
I think,
I'm not.
yeah,
I'm not saying. I'm not. I think the name of the channel is Fabian Liberty, right? Because while I'm not a socialist, right? I did take it from Fabius the General, as well as the Fabian Society, right? Which is like I don't think that this thing happens in 10 or 20 or 30 years, right? I think that what we have to do is we have to change, much like the communists, we have to change the philosophy of of a critical mass of individuals before any of these systems can really be established in any meaningful way. Um, Even still, I have no problem. One like the thing about anarcho-capitalism is that it's not prescriptive, it's descriptive, right? So we're looking at things from first principles and axioms to describe natural law philosophy, and then saying, you can't do these things because logically to argue for them is a performative contradiction. Obviously we have moral preferences wrapped into that. But there's no reason that a communist society couldn't exist or would in any way, shape, or form be against anarcho-capitalist philosophy, so long as there was, a few caveats, we'll say, without getting too
well,
long-winded.
I think my issue with the axiomatic view is it sounds like the axiom is just a premise dictated by thought, not by reality. How do you ensure that the axiom of thought actually can adequately premise the reality itself?
Well, how can you with your system? Like, what do you mean? Like,
Well,
what are
my
you
view is
asking me?
not
Like,
my view is not an axiomatic view. I don't believe in the possibility of really of axioms. I maybe I believe in God,
do you didn't? Okay,
but
so
that's maybe the
do you
only.
believe in Aristotelian formal logic?
No.
Okay, well then, like if you're gonna
Well,
deny
as long
like
as long
formal logic, then like
yeah.
fuck it, I'll just claim victory. You know what I mean? Like at a
But no,
certain
no, no.
point, like you're saying jibber
That's not
jabber
how it works.
if you're not
Because
if
no,
you
no,
deny logic.
no. I don't deny logic. Okay, logic is a very loaded term, but formal logic must belong to its proper formal place. For example, do I believe in mathematics? Yes, but do I believe that's universally applicable to every philosophical logic? Of course, it's not. Right? Sometimes
Okay,
it's not as
let me be
simple as that
specific. Let me
because
be
because
specific.
because sometimes philosophical logic entails the necessity of contradictions, which formal mathematics cannot sustain properly, right? And cannot be reduced to mathematics. So
When
formal logic, I believe formal logic is a real has a specific place for thought and for, of course it does, but you cannot assume that every logic conforms to the dictates of Aristotelian formal logic. Like, what does Aristotelian formal logic have to do with the various logic forms of logic employed by the Mesoamerican civilizations. Nothing. Aristotelian logic,
What?
formal logic.
What? It's true.
Formal,
It's true.
In order,
no matter where you are in the world.
Not
Or
true.
when.
Formal logic is only true if you obey the terms of the system. If you begin by saying, okay, axiomatically, I agree with this, you opt into the system of the formality, and that's where the formal logic has meaningfulness.
Okay.
If you don't opt in,
do you have an argument against the law of identity or the law of excluded middle?
Yes, yeah, I do.
What's your argument against the law of identity? Like become the greatest philosopher to ever exist in world history and prove the law of identity.
The law of identity is obviously valid when we opt into formal logic, but applied ontologically, it's an absurdity because every identity is necessarily contrived from its opposite. So how can A equal A when the variability for us to establish the formal variable A comes from quite informal processes, for example, of the material world? So applied ontologically, the law of identity is an absurdity. When we opt into the formal logic and we acknowledge the proper place, like we are saying A equals A as an axiom, then obviously it's valid, but it's not universally valid in every scenario.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that that you're accepting the law of identity as an axiom, but that you don't necessarily believe it's grounded. Not you personally, right? One accepts it, but it's not necessarily grounded. I would argue that it is grounded in existence exists. Can you imagine non-existence? Does existence exist?
I think non-existence is a feature of existence necessarily.
Well, so existence doesn't exist.
Existence is a reaction to its own non-existence, yes.
What does that even mean, dude?
Well, this is a level of philosophy that's not commonsensical. So if we want to get to here, it's like we are talking about ontology. Ontology doesn't conform to any standard of common sense. Existence, when I say existence is reacting to its own non-existence, I mean that the terms of something's existence do not reflect the form of its existence. Things necessarily derive from their very opposite, from things that appear contrary to them and in fact are contrary to them. Existence is a reaction to an immanent limitation of any given thing to be what it is. That's why there are different things, for example. So this is just dialectical ontology, but
right, but it's not grounded. It's not grounded in anything, right? Like your critique of saying you're accepting sophistry within your own framework to say that the law of identity doesn't work.
So who came before Heraclitus? Who came before Aristotle? Who came before Socrates? It was Heraclitus, wasn't it?
I mean, sure. What's the connection here?
What is the logos according to Heraclitus?
I don't remember what the logos is according to Heraclitus. I mean, I can give you a basic rundown of like Plato's tripartite, but I don't remember that specifically.
This is before Plato. Heraclitus, the logos is the basis of all of the formal forms that come afterwards, by the way. Form is just derivative of Heraclitus's logos, which is the identity of difference. Heraclitus says, no man steps in the same river twice. This is what he's famous for saying. So this was the point at which Greek philosophy broke from the mystical traditions of mankind, the Persians, so on and so on, and said, we are just trying to kind of derive this ultimate principle, this ultimate form from it, but the origins are from Heraclitus the Dark, who derived
I started this conversation by saying that Marxism was a Gnostic belief, and here we are, boys. If you're going to deny formal logic, it makes it difficult to have a conversation because all of the propositional statements that we're making in the English language are dependent upon that logic in order to be valid statements. Like we accept these things.
So does poetry obey the rules of formal logic?
It's a performance, right? It's like Habermas's performative
It's not just a
contradiction, right? Like
performance.
it's entertainment, but it doesn't
No, it's
actually
not.
make a statement.
Hold on. To say poetry is entertainment is like saying the Bible is entertainment. Does the Bible conform to the terms of formal logic?
In what way? Like there are places that are obviously
It
contradictory.
absolutely does not.
It
But that
obviously doesn't
but
in
the
certain
things
aspects.
why is it that the things human beings tend to find the most meaningful don't actually obey the terms of formal logic? The things that obey the terms of formal logic are not what we consider the most meaningful, but the things that we're just using to arrive at some kind of meaning.
Because okay, I mean, like I don't know that I can answer this, nor I don't know that you could either, right? But if I was to wager a guess as to why it is that human beings gravitate towards, sophistry or things that are
How
not
is poetry
grounded in logic.
sophistry? Do you think art is sophistry?
If poetry is an argument that is making a claim and it doesn't align with logic, then yeah, it's sophistry. It's bullshit. It's a performance, right? As an art form, right?
Hold on.
And as an art form, I was going to answer your question. So as an
Yeah.
art form, why is it that people gravitate towards, contradictions that then resolve and things like that? As an art form, I would say is that human beings, I would wager, oh God, what is this? Robert Bella has a book, right? On kind of understanding religion, the evolution of human religion from like the axiomatic to the something, right? And he makes an argument that I think is pretty good, which is that that there's kind of four modes of communication within humans. There's a unitive experience. There's the symbolic. There's the symbolic communication. There's narrative, and then there is theoretical. Right? We discovered theoretical much later in life. Right? So the hippie, the person that does DMT and sees like the tree of oneness, right, is having a unitive experience, a connection with the universe, right? The symbolic representation is where most art lies. Most art lies in a place where we have difficulty in attempting to explain concepts, where we're playing at kind of the edges of our ability to communicate what it is that we're feeling, and so we do it in a symbolic way that speaks to people, that communicates ideas, but it communicates ideas differently to different people with multiple interpretations.
So to save a lot of time, how can you say that all arguments and claims will begin and end with the axioms of formal logic when the meaning that is underlying these claims, that's actually at stake, necessarily has to take a contradictory form?
Because showing you a really cool painting isn't a fucking argument. It's cool.
Well,
it might make you feel a way, but it's retarded to say that that's a valid argument.
The argument is not the painting. The argument is the communication of meaning that paintings just convey in a more proximate way. For example, the credibility of an argument is not just about whether within some vacuum sealed system it's consistent, but whether or not it reconciles and makes sense to people, right? And in order for it to make sense to people, sometimes it actually does have to be contradictory and a formal level.
I'm not sure what this has to do with defending communism, but fuck it, I'm here for this conversation because it's interesting.
Yeah.
What I would say is that, right, in order for, like, I understand that there is meaning to be had, right? I totally get that there is meaning to be had from symbolic representations, right? Symbolic communication. There are things that we have difficulty saying in a narrative form that we can't quite put into words that we put into art. A great example of this that you can kind of bridge the gap between them, right? To give you an olive branch, right? Is like, the kind of the Campbell soup can famous, right? And kind of the last, anti-capitalist avant-garde artwork that actually existed. The rest of these people are just fucking college kids jerking themselves off, saying when really they're all part of the cool club anyways, right? You can look at, artwork that is kind of copying advertisements and derive critiques, derive arguments from it. You can feel a kind of argument that's there, right? You can do the same thing with USSR propaganda art, right? You can look at it and you can feel unity. You can feel strength. You can feel brotherhood. You can also feel a kind of a focus on industrialization and the mechanics of the machine, and you can feel the authoritarianism. You can feel the enslavement of the communist ideal, because you can feel the evil exuding off of the work itself. Obviously that might not be what you feel, right? But there are a lot of meanings and arguments per se that are encapsulated within something that's difficult for us to parse out.
But
what I'm saying is that it's not an argument that can be a valid propositional statement or a justifiable claim.
But I think you have you're too greedy, though. I know you're a capitalist, but when you say
altruism is evil, greed is good. Greed is based, and it is the most moral thing people can do.
I don't have a problem with that, but look, you say, for example, when we have a work of art, we feel these various concepts. I disagree. The concept is just something afterwards we derive in order to try and approximate what we feel. But it's not reducible to these things it's not reducible to them in general at all. But it's not as though, for example, the work of art is latent with some ideal, some concept. The concept is just a reflection, imperfect one, I should add, necessarily imperfect one. And why that is because, in my view, the ultimate object of human meaning takes the form of a contradiction between the premises of the form and the form itself. So form and content. That most elementary contradiction, objective contradiction, is the object of all human speech, all human meaning. So in an argument between two people, you can have an argument for, let's say, the devil's advocate and see who is more consistent with an agreed upon foundational axiom. You can have an argument on this basis and it can work, right? But that argument could never possibly satisfy the extent of meaningful communication. You are just kind of dwelling in some vacuum sealed system, but you're not actually arriving at truth. You're not arriving at the logos. You're not arriving at after what we call the bad infinity becomes possible, that we keep trying to solve it, and we fail no matter what we do, that you must accept that this is actually the solution of it is actually in the failure itself to solve.
Mm-hmm.
And this is how different objects, different intelligible things become intelligible, actually. In my view, this is just as much how an apple becomes intelligible within the realm of our phenomenal experience. We have to somehow accept that this inherent drive within us to consume and annihilate all things comes to a certain limit. And we define that limit in the form of the apple, right? We can touch it, we can see it. It obstructs the purity of our experience somehow. So to me, when we say, okay, we want to solve it scientifically and arrive at the objective truth, but even empiricism has to come upon its own limits. In a way, I disagree with, which says that, for example, we cannot actually know anything for certain. We cannot fully discover the truth of being in the universe.
There's some things we can know for certain, right? Which is something we already had to put. Existence exists, the law of identity, formal logic. I don't want to go in circles on that, because I don't know how to have a conversation with someone that says that their statements need not apply to logic.
When you say, for example,
you can have contradict when you say I can have a contradiction, right? And it's okay to contradict, and it doesn't matter. It's like A equals B, and it's like, well, fucking no.
No. So to simplify this, though, all the things you listed, which you claim we can know for certain, is it a coincidence that these things are abstractions?
In what way? What do you mean a coincidence?
I mean, they are abstractions. It's not like you're knowing anything determinate or specific. This is like the Kantian absolute object. It's just an abstraction. That's Hegel's criticism. What is that specifically, though?
I
Like,
can
that's
I
not
can prove
actually-
that I can prove that an apple exists. But can I prove that an apple exists? We could be in a matrix, right? But I can prove that I exist, right? By virtue, I mean,
Wow.
it's like Descartes, right? It's like basic, like I think, therefore I am, right? Like I exist in some capacity. And because I exist in some capacity, right, I recognize my ability for my consciousness to be able to grasp objects, right? My ability can conceive of things within the material reality, right? And because my consciousness can grasp and conceive things within material reality, then I know that some reality, some form of existence exists.
Here's the problem, though. The problem with the certainty, the Cartesian certainty you have in your own existence, is that it hinges upon you just changing the definition of existence itself to mean the confirmation.
What am I changing? Yeah. What do you mean? What do you mean I'm changing the definition of existence?
You're just defining existence in terms of your ability to experience your own thoughts.
Okay. What is wrong with saying that I can recognize the, hold on, sorry. So is there a form of non-existence where I exist in my own ability and to think? Like, is there a non-existence of conscious thought and a being that is thinking and identifying reality?
I'm just trying to say there is no way you can establish an absolute formal truth. It will inevitably stumble upon an internal contradiction.
What internal contradiction is there to saying that I as a being exist?
The internal contradiction lies in the way in which you're defining existence in the first place. How can you define existence in such a way that is not itself subjected to the test of existence?
What test can you think of non-existence?
The test of existence, you mean?
Well, how could one prove? How could one test existence?
Obviously, something that exists must confirm its existence in a way that goes beyond the mere claim of existence.
The claim is I exist. The evidence that I have for the claim is that I'm capable of making the claim. If I didn't exist, I wouldn't be capable of making the claim.
That's what I was going to say. It amounts to the view that existence itself is just the ability to make claims.
Okay, something makes, I mean, like, right, the unmoved mover, right? Like something is making the claim.
How can you be certain of the nature of your own claim? What is your claim? What does it mean to make it?
I already said I could exist in the matrix, right? I said that I could exist in the matrix, and this whole physical reality is fake.
What if
right?
we entertain the Spinozist view that you're just a kind of marionette and that you don't actually exist, and every single claim you make and every thought that you experience comes from somewhere else that's not you, so you actually don't exist?
Okay, well, I exist because I'm experiencing existence, number one. Now, you could say that I have no free will.
Okay, but how are you experiencing existence then? What is existence?
Well, here's an example. I feel pain. There is a being that feels pain. There's a being that is afraid of pain in some regard, right?
So
and some of it is a pain that I embrace.
What does pain have to do with existence?
It establishes that there is a thing that is feeling pain.
How do you know that this feeling of pain you're having is just an illusion? How do you know it's not an illusion?
Okay, let's take for an example that the pain I'm feeling is an illusion, right? Right? And we'll use the matrix, right? Is that I'm actually not feeling pain. I'm actually I'm in a brain vat.
Well,
right?
the idea would be that you don't even exist in the first place, and that the affect of pain,
which is I'm getting there. Yeah. The fact that I feel pain means that there is something that feels pain, be it even if it's completely internal, right? And it's just a brain in a vat somewhere. There's a brain in a vat somewhere.
It's not necessarily you, though.
I mean, like you could say that we're all one cosmic fucking being, and that the experience we have is actually fragmented consciousness, but that being exists.
Listen. If you ask me point blank, do you exist? Do I exist? Of course you do. But the reason
Why are we doing this on a debate about fucking communism? Right?
Because
Is it because you can't solve the ECP? Like, what's going on, my guy?
well, we took it here because you started talking about axioms and stuff. But the reason I'm being so tedious about this subject is because I'm trying to prove there is no way you can know anything with absolute certainty formally. There's nothing you can have formal knowledge of at all with any absolute certainty.
I am absolutely certain that existence exists. I know that, and I know that it is a fact.
Already established.
You not believing that is just funny to me.
But you know what you're actually saying? You're saying nothing, literally, like in a positive sense. Like existence, as you're describing it, is quite literally nothingness. The minute it becomes something specific, you can no longer lay claim to absolute certainty of it.
I think what you're trying to say is that it's circular, right? When you say A equals, then what are you trying to say? That I can't know a thing because I can't know a thing.
It attests to the positive reality of nothingness, that nothingness actually is something that exists.
No, it fucking doesn't. Because it's the only, you're just making claims. It's all you've been doing all night. You're just making claims. Back it up.
If you say the only thing I can know with certainty is that existence exists, and that existence cannot be anything in particular, then it's actually nothing which exists.
Existence cannot be anything in particular. No, the process of existing can exist.
It cannot. No, it can't. The minute it becomes something particular, you have no absolute claim to the knowledge of it anymore. It's just a contingent form of knowledge.
Existence exists, right? Isn't saying that I, Scott from Fabian Liberty, exists perfectly in my body, right?
You're saying you're not saying
the
that.
moment
you can't say that. You can't.
Right, you're saying
that.
The moment
you tried to say it, it would be a contradiction. You couldn't say it.
But right, so you're saying that it means nothing and it affirms non-existence.
No.
To
it means something. It means something. It means that nothing exists.
No, it doesn't. Saying existence exists doesn't mean non-existence exists.
That's only what it means.
Oh my. Okay. I don't look.
Because existence is an attribute of specific things. You can't mention any specific thing and lay claim to absolute knowledge of it. So the only thing you can lay claim to absolute knowledge of is the thing which doesn't actually exist, which is the abstract concept of existence.
So let me pull us out of this this late night looking at the stars as we drink whiskey and smoke cigars on the back porch to get back to a conversation about communism. Or maybe we don't want to go there. Let me pull us out here and just say, listen.
Yeah.
You said you act as if existence exists, right? You absolutely do. Or you wouldn't give a fuck about communism. You wouldn't give a fuck about any movement because it's all meaningless.
Existence is an attribute of things. Existence itself only exists as nothingness. So that's my view.
Dog,
right?
Yeah. That's your view. That's cool. I'm gonna fucking move on, right?
So
into reality where you admit that you live in a world where you affirm existence exists, at least in the way that you act and at least in the way that you feel.
You can think what you want. I would be happy to just go back to common sense, but here's the trouble. You can't just blame me for how we got here, because I tried to ask you, for example, what is an example of real capitalism, or how can you know that capitalism doesn't just become its opposite in your own terms?
Right, but you do realize you do realize that that was a pivot on your part, because I asked you to back up the claim that the mortgage crisis is inevitable because of capitalism, and then I said, I was like, back up your claim, and then you couldn't.
You asked me to back up that
you literally
claim.
stated that you couldn't.
You asked me to back up the claim in axiomatic terms. So, and then you wanted to describe the differences of our philosophical outlook. I want to do it in terms of common sense.
I don't need you to do it. Yeah.
So
You
what would
asked
be
me
a
to back up
proper?
my
Okay,
claim,
okay.
so then I dragged us into the
so
sophistry of existence proves non-existence. Like, no,
it's
like
not sophistry. It's
right,
Hegel. But
your claim is that
so
we
so
need communism, right? Like that is what you're here to
okay,
defend, is that we
okay.
need communism. So
So
I've
to
yet
make
to
this
hear an
to make this
argument
simpler,
from
okay.
right.
To
Okay,
make this simpler, okay. What would be a qualifying standard of proof in your view that because you asked me prove it that capitalism becomes its opposite, and I said, well, in actual history, that's what happened, and you said, well, that's not actual proof, okay. So what would be a proper standard of proof in your view, except because we know the actual experience of
yeah,
history clearly isn't. Yeah,
I've already given you the rationale that needs to be used, which
so
is
I
like
forgot.
taking an understanding of human action. You need to show that the incentive structure tends to such a degree that it is inevitable in that direction, right? You need to prove that humans prefer these things, right? So, in my opening statement, right, when we were talking about the inability of communist states, right, central planners to be able to solve the economic calculation problem or the local knowledge problem, whichever. I mean, like technically, they're
How
kind of
can you
wrapped up
prove that
together.
that's impossible? How can you prove that's impossible? By the way, by your own standard,
Which one, the ECP or the local knowledge problem?
both of them.
So if we look at the ECP, right, and we understand price as a mechanism of signifiers, right? What you gave me in response, I think, was like, I want to hear your argument again because I honestly it was like information technology or some random
Yeah.
mess.
So the view is supercomputers.
Right, the supercomputer, right? The
Yeah.
supercomputer, that may one day create perfect allocation of resources.
No, no, we've had
Um,
the computers for decades now. The ones we have now are way beyond what would be needed.
there's
Well,
no way in hell that there is a supercomputer in existence right now that can perfectly allocate all resources better than free market capitalism. And that is
why
the
not?
problem with the ECP because there is no because I'll explain. Because when you have a market economy, right? Um, when you have production, we'll go with production, right? You need three things in order for production to be successful. You need land, you need labor, right? And you need capital. Those are the three things that are necessary for production to occur, right? You
That's
need
kind of an axiomatic circular view, though. If you need capital for production itself, then obviously you win. But I disagree with that view.
okay, so how do you produce okay. So how do you produce things if you produce things only with land and labor and you don't have capital, right? Because
Yeah.
you're correct. You can do it without capital investment in a communist system. The problem that you have there is a totally different one than the ECP, right? Like it's a much, much worse problem, actually. And that is that even in an evenly rotating economy, right? So in an evenly rotating economy, the capitalist is not awarded profit for proper resource allocation. So this would be your supercomputer, right? Your supercomputer exists and perfect resource allocation can go everywhere, right? The capital investment is that we have scarce resources. So we have scarcity still, right? We don't live in the utopia with no scarcity. So because we have scarcity, that means that all resources can't all go to everywhere, right? Like you have a finite amount of engineers, right? You have a finite
Yeah.
amount of iron, you have a finite amount of whatever, right? And so when you have an evenly rotating economy, as which is a perfect scenario, assuming you have your supercomputer, right? Which I don't believe exists. But let's say you have it. You have your supercomputer with perfect allocation of resources. The capital investment is required in order to maintain people's need for time preference. Without capital investment, right, then what occurs in production is that you need to acquire all of the means beyond land and labor, right? So the means of production, like the tools, the skills, all of these things in some way in order to meet people's universal time preference. Now, if your supercomputer can also determine that, it seems to be your claim, right? Is that we don't need capital because we have computers that can determine the the time preference of every individual in society, and that includes every
Why are
part
we
of the
assuming?
economy.
Why are we assuming there's a difference in terms of people's time preference?
Yeah, so the universal time preference is basically this: is that people tend to prefer what they want now as opposed to what they want later, right?
Yeah. I'm aware of what it means. I'm just asking, why would we assume it's different? Obviously, everyone would want it to be as soon as possible.
Right. I mean, there are times people set it aside. You know what I mean? Like sometimes people want something in 6 months, right? But the rule tends towards if you want a pizza, you want a pizza now, not in an hour.
Exactly.
Right. So the capitalist, or the capital is used as a means of meeting. That is what profit is, right? Profit is not an exploitation of the working class. It's the reward that the capitalist has for meeting the universal time preference. They're the individuals that put forward the means for the workers and the land to be able to produce things, and because of this, get them out quicker.
I kind of find this a little bit too convoluted for the sake of the argument in question. If we're talking about a supercomputer, you're saying there's a problem of time preference and meeting everyone's time preferences. Do you mean to say that it would be unable to establish a rationale of priority because it's not based on money?
So let's take an example, right? So if we take an example, right, and let's say you are you're a bridge builder, right? You're in a communist country or whatever, like a state-run company, right? You're tasked with building a bridge, right? So you have two options, option A and option B. Option A, you build the bridge in one location, but in order to go through that location, you have to go over, option A requires you to go over a longer width of river. And then option B requires you to destroy a mountain, right? Now, in order to go to a long stretch of river, right? And let's assume they'll be equally perfect in terms of their usefulness as a bridge, right? It won't have any effect in the long term. So option A requires more material resources. Option B requires demolition experts or engineers to be able to build a bridge through the mountain, right? And so when you are you're the commissar or whatever, right? Overseeing this project, right? What you need to understand is you need to understand the proper allocation of resources. What is better? Is it better to use more iron, more steel, more stone, more labor for option A, or is it better to bring in engineers for option B?
Why couldn't a computer compute that based on, for example, the availability of engineers and the availability of resources?
Okay, so what the computer needs to calculate, right, is the computer needs to calculate the value without price, because price has been to some degree, the price mechanism is no longer there.
Hold on. Why does it need to calculate value at all? If this is a hypothetical, I know now in the world it's a real thing.
Well, that's the ECP, right?
It's like some vacuum utopia, and we're just doing it based on an axiom or whatever you're saying. Why would value need to be a relevant thing?
Because because humans have values, and in the example, we're only working.
The only value in question here would be a plan of some kind, fulfilling some kind of social demand, okay? That there would be no value at all. There would be a plan based on social demand. So it's not human beings.
Human beings have values. They have subjective preferences, correct?
Sure, but the value would not be alienated from the plan in some external abstract form. It would just be, this is the plan based on the specific demand, and how the demand is measured can be measured in a number of ways.
Okay.
But so
there is scarcity of engineers. There's a scarcity of material resources, right?
Sure. But why couldn't computers compute these things?
I'm explaining what the computer would need to be able to do.
But you said it would need value, and I disagree with that. It wouldn't need value.
Okay, it absolutely needs the value of one versus the other.
It would need the amount of labors that. It would need the amount of this is what I'm looking for. It would need the costs in material terms. For example, how much resources does this consume?
Okay, I think maybe you're hung up. I think maybe you're hung up on the term value as automatically denoting a currency value, right? What I'm saying is value. I mean that human beings value things in an order according to their psychic profit.
Not necessarily. There can be an objective cost, for example, based on the availability or the amount of hours of labor that need to go into it or whatever else.
Well, I mean, assuming that like you can
like I think the problem is like you're just tautologically assuming there would be a market mechanism, and that would not be the case here. Because you're basically saying like people would have, through the process of supply and demand, established this as more valuable, rather than this is objectively something that costs more than this based on the amount of resources it consumes.
No, what I'm saying is you live in a country with let's say 100 million people, and you have scarce resources, right? You have to choose between using more material resources or using more engineers. There is a limited number of material resources and a limited number of engineers.
Right. So I'm asking, why can't a computer compute that?
Okay, well, what is the computer going to compute? It's going to compute the proper allocation of resources towards its most efficient use. What its most efficient use is going to be based off of the subjective preferences or the value of all of the individuals in society.
No, it wouldn't. It would be based on the logic of the plan, not the subjective individual that has already gone into the determination.
Now you've just reinvented central planning, which is already a problem, but you're just saying a supercomputer's doing it. Like, that's not helpful.
Well, I'm playing the devil's advocate for you because this is what Paul Cockshot already.
No, don't play the devil's advocate. Like, tell me why I'm wrong if I'm wrong.
I think by your own logic, centrally planned supercomputer communism is definitely possible.
Okay, it's absolutely possible, right? That's not the argument. The argument isn't that it's possible. I mean, the USSR fucking existed. Like, that's not the argument. Is that it's not possible.
I'm saying,
you know what I mean? A lot of people died, but you know what I mean?
No, well, what I mean to say is it's like there's no reason to think free market capitalism would be any better than big computer socialism. By the way, I don't agree with you about how you're approaching this. Like, if someone asked me about capitalism, I'd be like, capitalism died in 1929, and then what came afterwards is not capitalism. Capitalism historically proved itself to be obsolete. And to me, that's a common sense view. But we're taking it to a level.
I think 1913 is a much better example in America, but go ahead.
Sure. It can be whenever you want, but it's like, to me, I'm like, history has proven it's not coming back. We're not going back to some ideal of capitalism. This is a new reality, and we have to get over it, right? But
no,
you're basically trying to say, no, you have to actually prove it within some vacuum sealed, abstraction. And I'm trying to prove to you that
I'm trying to ask you to back up your fucking claims instead of just saying, well, look, it's gone. So you know what? I'm right. Like, no, let's back up what you're saying.
Okay. What reason do we have to believe that it would not be gone? If it was somehow, first of all, there's two things we have to establish. How could it be possible to bring back something from the past after so much has changed? And then secondly, what makes you think the same thing wouldn't just happen again?
Okay, so we're moving off of the ECP because you really didn't like that because it's the knell of the Marxists because it proves them wrong. But now we're directing.
No, it's not. The ECP was debunked a long time ago by Paul Cockshot, and it's just like, yeah, you can use computers to centrally plan economies.
Sure. It was debunked. You know, we'll just like it was fact checked, all right? And Fox News determined that the fact check was correct. Like, come on, man.
Dude, we can look, but
you can't just claim someone else debunked it, you know? Like
we can go to the ECP if you want, but you said like, oh, you're just saying it's central planning, and I'm like, well, the idea, first of all, there can be a reconciliation between a central plan and various local plans that are based on a local feedback mechanism. I mean, information technology is sufficiently evolved. We're not just dealing with some top-down plan. We're dealing with a dynamic interaction between central plans that come from the top down and various different methods and ways in which they can be fulfilled. And I think information technology has evolved to the point where
this is
pretty easy and
this
seamless.
claim is just not based in reality, because
Okay.
the problem with the ECP is not just about the value of engineers and the value of material resources. It's the value of every single voluntary interaction in the market, and these subjective values and preferences of each individual buyer,
So in this
consumer,
scenario,
etc.,
there's no in this
changes.
scenario, there's no market in this scenario.
Okay, so in this scenario, right, where what we're trying to do is capsulate how is it that we can solve the ECP? Well, we'll just get rid of market economy. The problem is that when you frame the question or the example as we cannot compare it to a market economy, and how that works, then like it's like debunk communism with communism. Like, no, I'm debunking
Dude, wait,
communism
hold on, hold on.
with
I think you're
capitalist
confused.
theory.
Like I'm one of the few people that's like, yeah, that China is communist, it is socialist, and markets are going to exist for a very, very long time. Like, I'm not an anti-market guy, but you can't really say I want to debunk communism by just saying it's not capitalism, right? Communism, obviously, for most people, entails that markets become obsolete and markets cease to exist, because communism means that production is no longer based on exchange altogether. That's like something everyone can agree that, vaguely speaking,
No,
that's associated with communism.
maybe I
So
was maybe I was maybe I was miscommunicating what I was saying when you were saying, well, there's no market here, right? I'm trying to explain the differences between a market and between central planning with no
yeah,
market,
it
right?
obviously is a completely different logic. It's a completely different system.
Right. One works and one doesn't. Market
But you
economies
have,
work and
but hold on,
communism doesn't.
hold on. How can you prove the communist one doesn't work?
Because it works in the sense that it exists. What I'm saying is that because of the ECP, resources need to be spent in order to gain information that there are already signals within the market. Price is a signal to both the capitalist and the consumer, and the price includes millions of interactions that are constantly changing. And the
Yeah.
central planner is
You're saying
forced to
it is.
expend
So
resources
you're
to
saying it is.
obtain this information,
So what
and
you're
is
saying
less
is,
efficient.
you are saying it is impossible to compute the costs of production in material terms.
It is impossible to compute the cost of production in material terms.
Like, it has to take the form of a price. We can't just compute the costs of production and relate them in a rational way in order to fulfill a plan. A plan
I
already,
would
by
say
the
that
way, establishes a rationale of priority.
I would say that both in a market economy and via central planning, it is impossible to determine the true cost because time occurs in a linear fashion, right? So when you are utilizing resources or skilled technicians or
No,
whatever,
it's a
right?
matter
You are
of physics.
guessing. Yeah,
No,
you can
it's a
say
matter of
it's gonna
physics.
cost 20 rocks to build. It's gonna cost 1,000,000 rocks to build the bridge, right? But
Yeah.
what is the value of that rock? Well, the value of that rock is subjective.
No, value is only relevant in an exchange-based economy. You don't need to know the value of the rock. You just need to know whether it is necessary for the plan, the fulfillment of the plan.
Right,
And
but you have a goal.
maybe to simplify this for you, I think what you're trying to say is that we cannot rationally determine a plan in the first place because we don't know if we're going to be able to produce that bridge because we don't have enough information about the resources we have. But that is
No,
just
I'm
a
not making that claim.
groundless assumption.
No, I'm not making that claim. Like the socialist state building one bridge can always extract more material wealth and resources to get the job done. Eventually, even if there's hiccups, like they'll eventually be like, okay, well, we need more rocks, right? I'm not making that claim. The claim that I'm making is that the socialist system has a goal, right? And the goal is to get a bridge built, right? Because the bridge has social utility to the citizens that exist within the state, right?
Sure.
Which is to say, as of right now, they're taking a fucking rowboat across the river in order to move supplies. Once we build the bridge, people will be able to take a car, a truck, whatever across the bridge, no problem, right?
Yeah.
So the capitalist system and the socialist system both have this goal. And what I'm saying is that the ECP,
I don't
right, when
think
you
so.
break it
I
down,
don't think so.
shows that the communist system is less efficient and less capable of being able to provide to provide solutions to the problems that they have goals of fixing.
Okay, let's use that example then. In a capitalist system, people want a bridge. So how does the bridge
Mhm.
get built?
Right. So you have a private company that wants to build a bridge,
Yeah, who
right?
pays for it?
Maybe the town, whoever commissioned the bridge to be built. It depends.
So the government?
Well, I mean, under a true capitalist system, using taxation and theft from its citizens in order to build a bridge would be an element of socialism and
So
not
how would it be
capitalism.
how would it be the town then? How would the
Well,
town pay
assuming
for it?
that assuming that the town wants a bridge built in a purely free market economic anarchist community, right? It would depend
Yeah.
upon what systems they had set up for it.
So what would be an example of that system?
Let's say they're a covenant community and they have a form of voluntary taxation and they want to purchase a bridge builder to build a bridge.
Okay, so it's a government.
I'm not against government. I'm against states. I'm against
Yeah,
non-voluntary
but you're
government.
saying the government would pay for it.
That's one example. Another could
Well,
be
is there any
another
other
could be another could
is
be
there
a rich capitalist that lives in the town that wants to build a bridge and then put a toll on the bridge to pay for the bridge.
Yeah, but there's no way of determining with any approximate certainty that what the capitalist wants reflects what people want.
It absolutely reflects more than the central plan or what the people
Oh, you're
want.
saying
Because
that he would establish a toll. I forgot that part.
right, yeah,
Okay, so he would establish a toll, and then I guess the toll would pay for it.
sure, why not?
So it sounds like in socialism we have a bridge that people can drive on for free, and that in capitalism you have to pay a toll to pay for it.
Duh.
It doesn't seem
Like there's no such thing as free lunch, right? The default state of man is poverty. The default state of man is the coercive nature element of nature, right?
I
Like it's not
understand that.
free.
No, I understand
Somebody paid
that.
for the bridge.
Yeah, I understand that. It would be paid for by extracting resources from one place that it wouldn't in another place. But
Right.
it kind of just seems like to me that, for example, how
In a
you're
less
saying,
efficient way than the market.
no, I think that a capitalist having to kind of assess the demand of people subjectively that they want a bridge, then building a bridge and establishing a toll is way less efficient than a central authority just saying there clearly needs to be a bridge here. We're going to build one.
It's the exact opposite because the capitalist that invests their wealth and resources to build a project is making a bet on the future. And that is that they believe that they can make a profit in the future, right?
Yeah, but
so the
well,
reward
the problem is that it's a rent-based form of profit. He's basically just building this bridge, obstructing the flow of traffic with these tolls, by the way. That's not fun. And then basically collecting rent based on a utility.
If you get a supercomputer, I feel like my bridge can get an easy pass. All right. Like, let's not talk about obstructing traffic because of a toll. Like, if you get a supercomputer, I can have fucking easy pass, right? Like easy pass actually exists. Your supercomputer that can solve the ECP doesn't.
Hold on. Supercomputers are used by capitalist companies already. BlackRock has to use supercomputers. It's an AI called Aladdin. I mean, it's not even just a supercomputer, it's an AI on top of a supercomputer. So supercomputers are things that, I mean, we agree, I guess it's not really capitalism, but it's not like there's no precedent for giant scale enterprises or entities using supercomputers to calculate things like this. Although they don't encompass the scale of the entirety of society, computers compute things pretty fast. Tolls just obstruct the flow of traffic and collect rent.
Let's say
which
the problem.
It's a public good, right? Most people see roads and bridges as a public good.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not a fucking like standard right wing, like Republican, right? Like I call them socialists too.
But
I don't see it that way. I see it as theft.
Yeah, but do the sensibilities of average people have no bearing on any of this?
What is that? What do you mean? Like, are you telling me to like that? Like, I need to package my argument in a more in a way that makes people want to believe the truth?
In a way that's compatible with, and I know there's the whole fallacy of argument to popularity, but it's not actually what I'm saying. I'm saying people's sensibilities are important because we can all come up with whatever we want in a vacuum by individually thinking about it abstractly. But people's sensibilities, just like how you describe the market, actually reflect, you know, the ability for these ideas to be tested
Yeah.
in a way that's compatible with other people's
Yeah,
existence, right?
but
So
we're talking about rhetoric here, and I don't know that I necessarily want to get into a meta conversation about how to best sell these ideas to people.
No, I'm not
I'm more
saying that.
concerned
I'm
about the
not
truth
saying
of the
that.
idea.
I'm saying I think there's a reason why most people would have probably object to something like a bridge can only be built if one capitalist decides to take the initiative. And that's because most people see it as a public good because bridges
Well,
don't actually
my
themselves.
first example was a covenant community that
Right.
had a voluntary form of taxation that
Yeah, but
built
that's
things that
just
they felt that they
but
needed
that's
were
just
to
but
get
that's
around the free rider problem.
right. But that's just the government paying for the bridge.
Yes, like I said, a voluntary exchange. So the voluntary exchange that occurs both economically and all of this is deriving from bodily autonomy and voluntary exchange.
Okay,
What
well we
I'm
can go
talking
to
about,
that. Yeah.
so what I'm talking about is a voluntary action that people don't just vote with their dollar when we're talking about an anarchist society, right? They're not just voting based off of like some, you know, economic structure of what they think will be the most profitable economic system, et cetera. They're also voting with like their preferences for time, their preferences for convenience, right? Sometimes people will buy
How
like sometimes people will give up certain autonomy in situations because they prefer the convenience that occurs, right? So one person might choose to live in a covenant community where they have a voluntary form of taxation, right? And they have a voluntary form of they might even have a monopoly on in that area at the very least, right? On
so
like a policing system or whatever, right?
so
Because
here's my
they
question.
that
So here's my
convenience has
question.
value to
So
them.
I'm kind of confused about this notion of voluntary. So it's voluntary because at any point they're allowed to leave, correct?
I mean, it's voluntary because they choose it. In terms of at any point they're allowed to leave, I would say yes. I feel like the Marxist critique would be that if a contract was signed up to where you had to buy out, that there was some element of coercion that keeps you from leaving, much like
So
the
you
state we live in
understand
today.
that that's
But yeah,
see human beings don't function where every breath they take is a willful voluntary act. People want to live and dwell in communities, just like how
yeah, I
you
just said
said
that.
without.
We're
Yeah,
just rewording each other's argument, right? Like that it's
yeah,
that
yeah,
people will
yeah. But
voluntarily give up certain things for convenience sake so that they don't have to
well,
live.
here's no. Well, here's the thing. Do they voluntarily give these things up, or is it just something they take for granted? They never made a choice on it to begin with. It was never a choice they even made. Like if you grow up in one of these communities, you can say, yeah, well, when you turn 18, you have the right to totally cut yourself off from your family and become a sovereign individual and do whatever you want. But that's just not how human beings function in reality. Human beings grow up and are molded and conform to the communities they live in a pretty organic way. Nobody wants to have to totally
How's that
alienate themselves
involuntary?
because it's involuntary because it was never a choice given to you. You
It
never
is
had
a
the
choice.
ability.
No,
No,
what
you
you're saying is
never.
that there's a coercive element to the existence or to the idea that there are pressures, incentives for them to stay, right? Their family living there is one incentive.
But
Another
I'm
being
saying
a
they
lack of
never
knowledge
make
of
the
how to
choice.
exist outside of the
They
system.
don't. I'm saying they don't make the choice to begin with.
How do they not make the choice to begin with? You're talking about
Because
children?
yeah, growing up, you don't actually make the choice to begin with. You are where you're born, who
Yeah,
your
children
family
don't
is.
choose to be born, right? But I mean, that's a separate
Exactly.
conversation about that's a separate
So
conversation about
choice. So
bodily autonomy of
you
children.
can't say it's actually voluntary if it's never was the result of choice to begin with.
But you're not you're not highlighting the lack of choice.
You can say a choice is there, but that's different from saying that the form of association is the result of choice. If it's the result of choice, then that makes more sense to say it's voluntary. Whereas if the choice is there, it doesn't seem like the thing itself is voluntary. It seems like you can make the choice to completely leave.
I don't understand how something can be voluntary. And you're saying it's not voluntary because there's incentives that
No,
go
I'm
towards
saying
one choice or the other.
not, because it's not the result of choice.
How is it not the result of choice? You opt in.
No, you don't. You're born in a community, you're born in a family, and you never chose any of those things.
Yes, as a minor, right? You do not have a choice because you are assigned a guardian.
You think the minute someone turns 18, so all of a sudden they're choosing their circumstances?
I never said that they're choosing their circumstances. I said that they're choosing what to do in those circumstances.
And then it's not even limited to family. It's limited to culture. It's limited to community. These are things people can't premise their existence based on choice for. I mean, that would make human association and
but you're not actually making an argument that it's not a choice. What you're saying is that there are factors that incentivize people towards one choice or another.
I'm saying the choice may or may not be possible to make, but 99% of the time, it's not the result of choice.
Okay. 99% of the time, choices aren't the result of choices because, like, we're going in circles because you refuse to accept the fact that they do have a choice. That what you're saying is that there are pressures, and that those pressures.
It's not the result of making some like sovereign decision to be like, I voluntarily choose to live in this community. It's more like, I was born in this community. This is the community I know. These are my people. I grew up here. That's not saying, oh, I'm going to take it my stand. And it's like, I choose this. It's more, you only actually really have to
town A, there's town A and there's town B. Okay.
Yeah.
Town A and town B use the same currency, right? They use Bitcoin, they use gold, doesn't fucking matter. They use the same currency. Okay. Now in town A, a young boy is born. He goes to school. He lives with his parents. He understands the community. Town A and town B, very different culturally. They have different clothing. They eat different food, right? Yeah. He has no family there, etc. Now, he apprentices at the age of 15 to learn some skill. We'll say that this skill is the installation of computer systems for security systems, right?
Sure.
He lives, his dad understands this business, right? Now, he gets 18, he works there for like maybe another year, even though he's an adult, right? And he's 19. Now, town B, they don't have skilled technicians in what he has a skill in. And town B says, we're willing to pay you 30 whatever an hour. And town A says, we're willing to pay you 15 whatever an hour because that skill is abundant in town A. Now, the boy now has a choice. The choice is, do I make double the money, but I leave my family, leave my culture, leave everything that I know, and go live under a new culture, a new set of rules, a new community that I'm unfamiliar with limited connection to my family? Or do I stay, but I have less of an ability to make my way in the world as a man? That is a fucking choice, and there are incentives in both directions.
Listen. But here's, so this is a good example, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So, but you just said it, though. It's no longer about wanting to choose to live in this community because it actually is a community you want to live in, per se, but because of pure economic opportunity. But here's the kicker, right? I doubt that guy wants to be alienated from his family forever. One day he's probably going to want to go back and be with his family, most likely.
Course.
Unless he decides, fuck my family, I hate my family and my community, I'm starting from scratch. It's really destructive and antisocial, not good for a sustainable society in the long run. Okay, what if in town B, it's a voluntary association of perverts, and he has to do a lot of shameful things? You get what I'm saying?
They all watch anime. It's an anime town. Anime town B.
I'm saying it's an extreme example, but it's an example of how capitalism...
let's go with it. It's anime town B. They're all watching hentai.
It's an example of how sometimes you have to totally alienate yourself from your family and then potentially be pressured to do shameful or participate in some degenerate society. I mean, for example, I think
Right. That
maybe
plays in his
criminal.
choice.
Hold on. Let me finish. Maybe criminals have this dilemma a lot of the time, right? Gang members, they grow up with their family, no jobs, no job opportunity, nothing pays. I mean, they don't want to go become degenerates and peddle drugs and do all this stuff, but there's no jobs, there's no way of living, there's no way for them to earn their keep. So that's what they do, right? And it's just for money. Okay. This is how I think this is incompatible with a human existence where you can see your cultural and spiritual values harmoniously interacting with harmoniously
no, this is cope. This is full-blown cope. You value your culture, your community, your family, and being away from degeneracy more than you value the potential profit in town B, and that's your choice. To you, it feels like no choice because those things are incredibly important to you as an individual.
Yeah,
but to the boy, maybe he's a fucking degenerate and he likes fucking whacking off to anime waifu pillows, and town B is even better.
So, but here's the thing, all right? Let's be real though. I mean, most people don't think in this way. Most people do think in the sense of, no, I don't want to do shameful, bad things or degenerate things. I just want to earn a good living. But for most people, it's not about, I prefer to have more money than the money I have now. That's a given, obviously. But for most people, it's, how am I going to fucking make a living and survive? How am I actually going to have a minimal baseline dignified standard of living that's going to keep me afloat? It's not like, oh, I make
with capitalism.
It's kind of,
that's the best way to do it.
Well, it's not the case though, because listen, you're saying, oh, in town A, it's a trade-off. It's just a trade-off. But sometimes the trade-off is between actual like sustainable subsistence and, you know, complete pauperization and impoverishment. That's not a real choice. That's just a form of coercion.
So what you're saying now is that the argument you're making.
Imagine
the argument you're making is actually nature is coercive, and I agree, right? But the problem is that coercion now becomes meaningless as a term.
But this is not nature, because we're not just.
It is nature.
Because we're not in this case, and it's never the case in capitalism, that we're simply dealing with a spectrum of successful communities and unsuccessful communities, and it's just this like neat spectrum. What we see is an extreme form of the polarization of inequality, which is based actually, and as a libertarian, you should probably agree with me on this, it's based in the way institutions, monopolies, and establishments concentrate power at the expense of the majority. And that
I agree.
Itself, and that takes the form of an acute polarization. You don't just have these two communities that are like on a spectrum but somewhat comparable. You have one is a complete shithole, East Palestine, Ohio, and then another one is this nice, shiny, gentrified place. And it's like, you go to America,
you should move out of East Palestine, Ohio, right?
Yeah,
like, don't drink the water.
Those people would love to move out, but they fucking can't because they can't afford to live anywhere else. So it's like, that's the reality of capitalism. It's not like, oh, I want to choose. It's not like a video game where you're like, oh, I'm going to go live here. I'm going to go live here. It's like, damn, this is my life. I live in a shithole. I live in the shitty part, and the hipsters live in the good part. And it's not a choice.
So there's multiple arguments that you're making here that are kind of like recycled arguments, right? There's two arguments, I think, mostly that you're making. Number one argument is that nature is coercive, is the explanation I would give, right? Which is that is the explanation that I would give to the argument that you're making, which is that people need to eat.
You're wrong. Town A and Town B share a river, or they share, they're both under the same oil, right? Who gets the oil? Who gets the river?
Who gets the river?
Who gets access to the resources?
I mean, like, there's not enough information here for me to honestly answer that question, right? Like, it would depend on a whole bunch of variables.
Well, what I'm
Right?
trying to
Was
say is
Town
that
A there first and
I'm
homesteaded
trying
the
to
river?
say
Like, I don't understand.
there are things Town A and Town B actually have in common,
Hmm.
right? That make it so that we're not just dealing with two entirely different human communities.
Of
We are
course.
dealing with two entirely human communities. We're dealing with two human communities that are the outgrowth of some same common social substance.
Okay, but what is the argument? Again, I'm not even sure what argument you're making now. It seems like you're just talking about the importance of culture, talking about the
What I'm saying is
importance
that
of
it's not.
community.
I'm saying it's
This isn't
not
an
an
argument
inevitable.
for communism.
I'm saying it's not an inevitable result of nature that Town A, East Palestine, Ohio, is a complete shithole compared to Town B, which is a hipster gentrified place. Sometimes it's monopoly capital that is centralizing the forces of production to make one people live happily and fine and completely neglect the others.
The town A and the town B, the hypothetical that I gave, right, is a thought experiment that I'm utilizing in terms of an individual's choice to live in one community or to leave said community. Right now,
Right.
you're bringing
And
it.
then you,
You're
but
bringing
then
the
you gave the
hypothetical.
example.
You're bringing in the hypothetical into a non-capitalist, mixed market,
But
socialist
did you notice?
state,
Hold on.
and then highlighting the problems
hold
of
on.
that.
The
It's like,
reason,
yeah, I fucking agree. Those are problems.
but in your example of Town A and Town B, in order to prove that it's voluntary, you actually had to give an example of an incentive to move to Town B that has nothing to actually necessarily to do with how Town B is organized. It's the same common measure, money, right? Town A, for example, is
I can change it right now. I can change it right now.
Okay.
It's
Yeah.
super simple, right? Get rid of
Yeah.
the job thing, right?
Yeah.
From Town B is full of degenerates. Town B is
Yeah.
full of people we don't like, right? We don't like Town B. Town B has a shitty culture, right?
Yeah.
Like women are equal. It's fucking stupid over in Town B, right?
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
right? Waifu and anime everywhere. But there's one girl that comes into Town A. She visits, right? Whatever your perfect woman is, imagine her, right?
Okay.
Whatever values you want her to have, whatever way that she looks. Oh man, she's everything you want. And she comes over into the bar, and the boy from Town A, he meets her, right? See, there's a problem, and that is her whole family's in Town B, and one of them has to make a choice to move and live. They fall in love. They're ready to get married, but you got to live somewhere. Do you live in Town A or live in Town B?
That's easy. Say if she's actually a good woman, save her from degeneracy. Have her live in a good town. That's easy.
Yeah, those are your values, right? Those are your that's what you value.
Yeah,
that's what you want. That's what your perfect girl wants too. So your perfect girl voluntarily chooses to leave Town B and has a choice and moves to Town A, thus proving exactly what the fuck I was talking about.
But what if it was the reverse, right? If it was the reverse, and this is a degenerate guy taking this innocent girl and having her make the choice to go be a whore in Town B, you have just described a socially destructive phenomena that's incompatible with a sustainable human society. Obviously, if you give people the choice to do, if you confront them with the choice in the first place, a whole host of if you confront people with the choice, meaning you set up a fucking meth shop in the middle of a village, yeah, people are going to make choices, quote unquote, because they're going to be confronted with the choices they wouldn't otherwise have to be. But this is a socially destructive phenomena that's incompatible with any sustainable human society.
So this is again where we go back to, I don't know how this is communism, but like
my argument is basically this, right? The paradigm of purely voluntary association alienates people from their families and their communities. Now, in the example you listed, the woman is already coming from an a priori alienated community where everyone's being degenerate and nobody has these solid communal values that actually reproduce functioning human community, right? So it doesn't actually apply. Her making the choice to give up her choice and actually live in a human community and conservative kind of society that's not actually her entering into a voluntary association. That is her giving up her so-called voluntary free choice.
By choice.
Right? Well, you can say it's by choice, but it doesn't matter. Because in the opposite... Well,
it does matter because you're the one claiming there isn't any choice.
But here's the problem. One of the communities is a community premised on the basis of choice. It's degenerate, for example, right? The other community isn't. So if you're saying that people have the right to make the choice to no longer have to be confronted with choices, that's fine. But that's not the problem. The problem is the ability for people to be confronted with the choice to do socially destructive behaviors that destroy society. That's the problem. It's a one-way problem.
I have to explain. I have to explain this.
Yeah.
No, I have to explain. This is the problem with libertarianism as it meets other political philosophies. When other political philosophies say one ought do something or one ought not do something, right? There is an element of coercion and force and violence that backs that up, right? And so, right, like the communist is willing to throw you in the gulag for doing the degenerate, harmful things for the sake, right? For the sake of the greater community.
I'll give you an example where I say yes to the gulags. Someone who's trying to bring fentanyl into a community. Yeah, send them to it. Not only send them to a gulag, just what Trump said, quick trial, right? Worse than a gulag, right? And I think...
Yeah, I think that's monstrous, but I'll come back to that. Let me finish this
explanation. I think that's totally moral. I think there's such a thing as...
Right, but that's because you don't believe in bodily autonomy and freedom. You believe that those things must be sacrificed by force for a greater element.
I believe in freedom of the people. I don't believe in individualistic autonomy for everyone.
That's group rights, group responsibilities is such a silly thing. But I'm going to set that aside for just a moment because I want to finish my explanation. The problem here is that when, like I said, when the communists or when the statist, the Republican, the Democrat, whatever, when they say one ought not do something, there's an implication of an element of force from the state that be utilized to stop that behavior. And the libertarian, right, it doesn't have that. And you're saying, well, the choice leads to all of these problems, right? But the problem is that because libertarianism isn't actually telling you how to set up your society. What libertarianism is saying, this is a descriptive philosophy of natural law. This says, what are we justified in using violence to stop other people from doing? When are we allowed to kick down your door and throw you in the gulag because you did something? And our answer to this is when you violate someone else's bodily autonomy.
It's a pure individualism.
But the thing that is discounted, the thing that is missed, and is the understanding that doesn't mean that not making moral claims about certain things doesn't devoid people the right or the responsibility to make moral claims and have voluntary enforcement of those things. And so Town A is better than Town B. And the reason Town A is better than Town B is because everyone that moves to Town A agrees there will be no meth shop. And if you bring in meth into our town, we'll kick your fucking teeth in.
I think it's extremely arbitrary how you're defining the scale of voluntary association. Why can't the scale of the USSR be a voluntary association? Why must it be a town?
I never said that it must.
Why can't, so how are we not just getting back to the state then? The state is just a voluntary state. I mean, you can leave the United States of America, technically.
Sure. Could you leave Russia at every point in its history voluntarily?
The problem with leaving Russia is that...
Or the USSR?
The problem is that you would probably have to leave on some form of state-owned property like planes or boats or cars. But could you leave by foot? Yeah, you could. You could just leave.
Maybe, foot, right? Maybe you'll get permission to do so. You could just
leave by foot. You don't have the right to use the airplanes owned by the Soviet government to go wherever you want.
There's a critical difference between the USSR and the United States of America, right? Yeah. And a voluntary government. And the critical difference is, how was that property that they claim to own obtained? And so just one example of why the United States government is not a voluntary government, for example, would be the Cherokee Nation in northern Georgia, right? They did literally everything right. They homesteaded property. They got a post office. They started accepting Western culture and clothing. And they said, hey, this is our land. We own this land. And we want to be a part of your community, a part of your culture, a part of your society. They sued to not be driven from their land once. They lost their Supreme Court case. They sued again, right? And they won their Supreme Court case. And Andrew Jackson said to the Supreme Court, send in your marshals, and then just made them walk the Trail of Tears anyways. So that land in northern Georgia is not voluntary association. It's quite literally, by every definition, stolen land. It is land that in no way, shape, or form.
On a certain level, though, if we're being reasonable, does that apply to every state on Earth?
I wouldn't be probably, but I wouldn't be confident enough about every single state's existence in their history to know that might not apply to some nations.
So do you find the illegitimacy of a state to be just based on the displacement of previous people living on land, or the
displacement?
So why are states bad?
Well, because they're inherently aggressive. Because they have aggressed upon people. Displacement of people is one example.
So what separates a town government from a state?
A town government that isn't a state from a state would be a town government that all of the land and property that is owned is legitimately theirs. They did not steal it from anybody. They didn't aggress upon anybody to obtain that property.
That's not how a state is defined, though.
Right. I understand that that's not how a Marxist or most statists would define a state. That is how I'm defining it for the purposes of conversation from a libertarian perspective. I do agree that we have a different understanding of the definition of the state.
Okay, so hypothetically, I don't think Switzerland stole any land. Is Switzerland a state?
Hypothetically, Switzerland didn't steal any land, right?
Yeah, is Switzerland a state?
So Switzerland would still be a state in the sense that it is not voluntary. Well, I don't know. I mean, if Switzerland never stole any land and the system of governance that children grew up in and came to, there was a legitimate single private property owner of the entire nation of Switzerland, and the form of governance that they have.
What separates a private So you're basically saying if it's a monarchy, it's not a state? Because that sounds a little
well, I mean, a monarchy derived with non-aggression would just be private property. Yeah, like you're king of your own land. Everyone else that is, like, if you didn't aggress upon anybody, then yeah, it's exactly what it is.
So a peaceful monarchy is not a state in your view?
Not a peaceful monarchy, but a monarchy that was established in such a way that they gained all of their land voluntarily and peacefully.
By the way, how do you determine whether the gaining of land was voluntary?
That is, we're getting close to midnight. Hold on, we're getting close to midnight, and I'm intermittent fasting, and I gotta fucking eat soon. Sure. But establishing private property rights and bordering philosophy and argumentation ethics and all of those things is a much, much, much longer conversation than I have 7 minutes before midnight and I got to eat by 1 and get out of here.
Yeah. No
I wouldn't mind discussing libertarian philosophy at larger length whenever the fuck you want, but I just don't I don't have time to go through all of that right now.
Yeah. So do you want to wrap this up somehow, or?
How the fuck do we wrap up this conversation? You came here to defend communism. We talked for like 45 minutes about art. We talked about fucking philosophy and existence exists. I don't know. Communism sucks, but I'm glad that we had this conversation because there's not too many intelligent streamers.
I think it was an interesting discussion, But I just think the main difference that made it difficult was like my view is just based on the real world and history. Where I don't mean to say that condescendingly, but it's like
Fuck
I
you.
don't
My
think,
world's mine's based off of that too.
yeah, but mine's not like based on an axiomatic view. Mine is like, okay, um, capitalism is what it has been historically, and communism is what it was historically. I'm not interested in introducing like from scratch some totally new system. I'm here to talk about like systems that are in place, that have been in place, and that reasonably could be in place based on either history or the tendencies of history. So even the first Marxists, for example, were not like, oh yeah, we want to establish this socialism from scratch. Engels critiqued that in Socialism, Utopia, and Scientific. They were rather saying we are anticipating and witnessing the transformation of a capitalist mode of production into a socialist mode of production, and we are just acknowledging that fact and giving political form to it. So I think that's maybe the difference of how we approach the issue.
You know, I would say that, you know, if you consider yourself a leftist, not you personally, but this is to the greater
Yeah.
audience,
Yeah.
right? If you consider yourself a Marxist, you know, I don't know that I should even reinvent the wheel here. You know, read Bakunin's critique from a leftist perspective. You know, I think you can say all of that, that communism is, you know, just a form of historical analysis of acknowledging a reality of the destruction of capitalism. And you're saying that, but the problem that I
The
see
acknowledgement is
is,
practical and it's political. It takes the form of a political activity.
yeah. I mean, Marxism, I think more than anything else in the world has established the idea of praxis, right? I think more than any other philosophy has stated that knowing and seeing and believing in a certain political philosophy, it is, you know, incumbent upon that is doing the philosophy, right? You know, which is why I hate it so much. But nevertheless, I would say, you know, Bakunin's critique of Marxism from the very beginning, before any revolution ever occurred, was, I think, spot on in understanding exactly what would happen, which is that it's not anarchism, it's not freedom, it's not individual liberty, it's another form of statism, and with that statism comes is a movement towards this ideal that is never reached. It is the anarcho-communist ideal packaged into authoritarianism and inefficiencies that could never reach the pinnacle of capitalism
I think
when it's implemented.
the result of a lot of disagreement, because I don't think it's true that the Marxist conception of communism, which is stateless and so on, is the same as anarchism. It's not stateless because it's a bunch of individuals associating based on individual choices. It's stateless because the state becomes superfluous. There's no longer a need to administration of man, just an administration of things, because human society and culture has become unified in an organic way, in a way that doesn't require any kind of external formalization. And it does, it's just statism, which is this kind of, what I mean to say is this: Marxism is still collectivistic. It still sees the collective as the subject of truth and of politics.
Mm-hmm.
It still sees humans as inherently social, and it doesn't see the individual as the unit of association in the first place, right? It sees communities, how social forms reproduce. So that's the difference. That's why Stalin in his
what are communities made up of?
They are made up of people, of course.
Individuals with individual values and preferences. It's just gigatarded to think that like the best unit of measurement is the community. It's individuals in the community that make up that collective.
Just because individuals are empirically definite to other individuals doesn't make them the highest reality of individuals themselves. Individuals' highest reality is always something that could never be tangible in an individual. It's the reality of something
what external. What the fuck is highest reality?
Like, for example, something meaningful, something truthful, something real is never tangibly incarnated just in an individual, except in
Hey,
the case
hold
of
on one second. Y'all motherfuckers are telling me in your chat. I saw that. All right. I don't normally comment on chat. I didn't end my fucking stream. It crashed and I had to redo a stream. I'm still live on Rumble, motherfuckers. All right, go ahead.
yeah, I'm not even seeing chat right now, but
I'm
yeah,
trained to read chat constantly.
I think, like, of course, individuals are real, and I'm not neglecting the reality of the individual, but I think individuality is meaningless when you're not talking about what that is an individual of.
Yeah, I mean, look, again, I don't.
I think, yeah, that's what it
I don't
says.
understand. This is the weird thing, is that, like, you say a lot of things that I agree with that are commiserate with libertarianism, and yet the claims of communism are the things we're not that we haven't been talking about all night. The economic claims, the historical claims,
Yeah.
any of the, it's like we're talking
Sum it up.
a conversation about things we both agree on. Yeah. And it's like, that's cool,
so
but like that doesn't really work.
This, right? I obviously have a lot of objections even to your utopian scenario, and you know that. But let's just sum it up somehow. Like, assuming I'm like, you know what you say on paper, I don't mean to like be ironic or whatever, but I mean it genuinely sincere. Like, what you say on paper, I'll just be like, you know what? That doesn't sound horrible to me. Like, yeah, everyone's just voluntary association, no coercion, no violence state. Like, that doesn't sound like a bad thing to me. But I just think you're for example, if we did a Ron Paul libertarian movement in this country, okay, it would take a polarization form of class struggle. Like, there'd be a ruling class who's against it, and there'd be a popular strata that's fighting for it. And that polarization will invariably give rise to the necessity of a state, because upon trying to destroy the state itself, the powerful elements of society that want to preserve the old system are still going to be there, and they're somehow going to need to be suppressed in some unified way. Also, foreign countries will want to engage in aggression against you, and that must be confronted in a unified way. And also,
I have answers to all of these.
There must be a subject of the politics in the first place. Like, the American people, first of all, want anarcho-capitalist, whatever utopia. Maybe the Mexicans don't want that. How can you force it on them? Maybe the Canadians don't want them. So American people are still the subject, and the American society.
Do you think it would be? Hold on, pause. Do you think it would be justified to invade Mexico because Mexico still has some form of governance that you disagree with?
I'm saying you're not saying that. So because you're not saying that, the subject of the anarcho-capitalist society will still be one people, one subject. And that, in contradistinction to other countries, and in contradistinction to its own internal enemy, right, which is not going anywhere. Remember, you can say, like, okay, I just want a society where all the differences can be given particular form, right? But you see, even if you die on that hill, it's going to polarize society in two, between the people who want what you're saying and between the ruling class who wants to preserve the status quo. So, and they're going to have a hegemony, and there's a lot of people who are still going to be behind them. So it's still going to take the form of two. It's going to be a polarization. And my view is that inevitably the state dictatorship for the suppression of the class enemy would be necessary.
The problem with that, like, I don't understand the crystal ball thinking here. It's not an unreasonable assumption to believe that there is a ruling elite that has power and wealth in our current system.
Would they give up? Why would the monopolies just give up? You know?
Right. I mean, like, the problem here is, it's not, let me go back. It's not an unreasonable assumption to state that in our current paradigm, right, that there is a ruling class per se, right, made up of those that have a lot of capital, right, that are have a lot of power, be it and that there's kind of this branches of the cathedral, as Mencius Moldbug, or right, working together. You know, the same people rubbing elbows together. The media, the large corporations, the political families. You know, the globalist kind of individuals, like, you know, the World Economic Forum and, you know, IMF and these kind of. It's not unreasonable to say that there is a struggle between that, right? Populism is kind of like really like that. So that's our starting point, right? Us versus them. The class struggle from the Marxist perspective, but even from a libertarian perspective, it would be the same, right? Is that, you know, it is an us versus them. The problem is that populism is an unevolved political philosophy. It doesn't tell you how to manage the economy. It doesn't tell you how to manage property. It doesn't tell you how to do all of the things that a state does. And so eventually populism has to evolve into another political philosophy or ideology, right? It can't stay populism because populism is, it's off with their heads. But then what do you do after that, right? Do you do the Black International?
No.
And I think we agree on that initial populist surge, right? That there are the ruling class. My problem, and the reason that I go into these axiomatic positions, the reason I'm talking about economics, is that I'm talking about, well, where do we go from that populism? And what you put forward, communism, not just, right, the economic system and the philosophy behind property rights and things of this nature are coercive and are inefficient. And a lot of people are going to die if you put coercive, inefficient things into a power structure.
So look, we can talk about the system, right, later. But all I'm trying to say is that it's not just an initial thing. It demarcates a real clash of interests. And what I'm trying to say is that I don't see how an anarcho-capitalist society will dispense with the need for some state dictatorship to suppress.
Why do you need a dictatorship?
Because it's going to polarize society in two, not into 5, not into 6, not into 7, not into 10, to 2, right? Those who want to preserve the status quo or restore it, and those who, and by your definition, want a free society, right? So that polarization will mean there's going to be an internal enemy that will do everything in its power to re-establish power. How can all of these disparate, separate communities defend themselves unless they combine their strength and, you know, fight an enemy who also has a combined level of strength? So I think a state would just inevitably reemerge.
Okay, but first off, you're assuming that after I don't understand where this argument comes from in the timeline, but your assumption is that there will be a group of powerful people that are against the population. Yes, agreed. I don't understand why we have to destroy free markets, why we have to destroy the ability for people, like why we have to set up a state of central planners to stop the wealthy.
Let's talk about free markets. All right. So you overthrow you basically overthrow the government, right? Anarcho-capitalism, but half of the country plus the European Union plus all these other countries are going to do everything in their power to fuck up everything you're doing, right? So what if they just
maybe not?
So that's where we'd have to disagree, because I think it's an absolutely yes, they would. If half of America,
can you prove that? Can you prove the future?
Yeah.
Go ahead. Prove it.
Anytime a country overthrows a status quo in history, you had a result of all of the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution. You know, that's what happens. But reasonably speaking, even if I couldn't,
it's not proof.
Okay, so I'm just going to ask you this question: if let's say if 50% of the country overthrows the government, and then 50% maybe is somewhat weakened, do you think that the other bad countries that are allied with the U.S. government, NATO, you don't think NATO is going to intervene to help the U.S. government reclaim?
Well, the first thing we're doing is we're assuming that the Marxist revolution takes place, right? Like that doesn't necessarily need to be the mode, right? Well, it doesn't necessarily be. Well, I mean, for example, there are multiple ways that that you could separate yourself, right? Likely
Okay.
going to be bloodshed. You're probably right, right? But
Yeah.
I can't predict the future, but let's assume the likely scenario is
Yeah.
either is some form of secession, right?
Okay.
Individuals moving together, seceding,
Sure.
and then having to fight for their land.
Okay. So if the U.S. government is not capable of fighting that secession, which is what I think you would expect, do
Mhm.
you think it's unlikely that they're going to do everything in their power to destroy it after they even back off militarily? And finally, what makes you think they're not just going to have all of NATO and all of their global allies intervene here?
So it's not a matter of, first of all, we're getting away from any form of discussing morality outside of a consequential
Because
sense.
I'm talking about reality.
No,
Like, this is a
yeah, no,
pragmatic
I'm no.
necessity.
I understand. We're playing out. We're doing a thought experiment in the future about how one would defend itself,
Yeah.
right? And so it's like if you established, let's say, the state of New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine became its
Yeah.
own, like seceded, right?
Yeah.
The thing is that it wouldn't just secede and become an anarcho-capitalist polycentric community. Again, hence the name Fabian Liberty, right? It's like, I don't think we're just going to like magically dust our hands off and be in the polycentric anarchistic town A, town B communities. What likely happens is that due to clashes, one group coalesces in another area that have shared similar values. And eventually those values become so combative with the other kind of the other regions that they become their own factions. And so the question is when this more minarchist, freedom-based, more free market, society, closer to free market, I should say, society branches off, it's going to be a country, right? It's not going to be an anarchistic commune, of like 1,000 polycentric communities.
It can be a
Like that
country.
process doesn't really make sense. Like I don't get to flip a magic button and create Ancapistan and its 1,000 variations overnight. Like that's just not that's not the process
Okay,
by which we would get there.
listen. Whatever process you think it is it incompatible with the interests of those who are in power and the U.S. state?
Yeah, obviously.
Okay, if that's the case, I don't see how you can avoid the need for a state to defend your interests versus theirs.
I just said that that's almost certainly what would occur.
So
right? Is that like there would be right? There would be a more minarchist state. That would be the first step.
It would be a state that is dealing with the internal enemy of sabotage and infiltration and the foreign enemy, right?
Sure, I guess. I don't know. Like, I mean, I'm
Okay,
sure CIA will be in the new state, right?
All you have done is recreate the USSR. Congratulations.
Yeah, except the USSR wasn't more minarchist, more capitalistic, more free market. It was the exact opposite. It was an authoritarian state without a market economy.
Then yeah, but the need to undermine the market and the need to undermine other forms of power besides the central one will be reflected in the very antagonism I mentioned. What if one of these communities is a huge HQ and they got bribed by NATO to just start fucking launching missiles at everyone else? You're going to have to make everyone fall in line with a central plan, a central agenda, and a central.
This is like 7 layers of what if in the future where you're this is what I was talking about in the very beginning. This is what I was talking about.
Listen, if you're at war with the most powerful countries on earth, which will happen, okay? There's no doubt about that. It will happen. Why would they not? Why would they not take advantage of how decentralized your whole society is and how much there's a lack of like enforced unity, right? If you could just bribe using some
because it would be more effective than anything a communist could ever create.
Sure, it might be more effective in the long run, according to your argument, but in the immediate
and in the short term.
But in the immediate pragmatic necessity of needing to defend your country from your liberty from all these other people, you're going to have actually have this like central dictatorship that enforces one policy of defense and one policy of No, you can't collaborate with the enemy. No, NATO is not allowed to buy your little town and use it as a base to launch missiles at us. You're going to start imposing a lot of strict laws and uniformity. And guess what? You're going to have to clamp down on the market. Otherwise, it's just going to be used as a vehicle for the enemy to come and buy everything and just destroy the whole thing before it can get off anywhere.
So this is what happens when you have a Gnostic belief, is that you begin to start telling the future, and then you use your Marxian analysis to tell the future. Like, I can do this. No, I can do this right now. I can do the same thing.
Hold on. Why reasonably would these things not happen, in your view?
When you say you're asking me to prove a negative here, right? You're asking me to prove that this thing won't occur in the future. My claim is not that. My claim is that you don't fucking know. You're telling the future like 7 steps ahead.
Dude, nobody knows with certainty, but I could say it's likely. I could say it's reasonable this would happen from a perspective of strategy.
Okay, if there's a 2%, like, let's say we could mathematically calculate. We can't, but let's say we could. And there's like a 2% chance that each of these steps happen. Eventually you're getting to a point where your predictive power is zero.
No. Dude, the problem is yes. I'm trying to make the argument that logically it is reasonable to assume it will happen. Now, you can't know with certainty, but it's reasonable to assume, according to the logic you yourself are such a big fan of, that this would happen.
It is reasonable to lay out a theory about what might happen. Sure. It's reasonable. It's reasonable to act based off of that theory, right? And to attempt to calculate what's occurring in the future as a means of making plans.
So based on how we know the world works, it doesn't seem likely.
Neither of us know how the world works, right?
I think based on how we would probably both admit we think the world works, it is reasonable to assume that if a society forms in the United States, which is opposed to the interests of the ruling class and the U.S. government, that the U.S. government and NATO will do literally everything in their power to try and destroy it. And I think that's reasonable to assume.
But it's not. Like, you can't just say, well, that's almost certainty, right? Like, it's a possibility. It's certainly one of many.
Can you give me one, in your view, possible scenario where the U.S. and NATO are like, you know what, hands off, we're just gonna let this be, and we're not gonna try and fuck with it in any kind of way?
Okay, so we've moved from one extreme to the other, right? Your first extreme. This is a false dichotomy. The first extreme is either like the world goes to war to destroy this burgeoning country that is based upon a minarchist form of government to stop it. Yeah. And then it's either that or nobody steps in and fucks with it at all. There is a spectrum of all different types of things that could occur in the future. I'm not in the business. I'm not in the business of saying what the future is. Yeah. But no, this is. Now, I haven't been able to get to the first point that you didn't want to let me get to, which is that this is what happens when you have a Gnostic belief. It's no different than the critical race theorists. I believe racism and white supremacy is at the root of all problems. And once you have that belief, you can begin to analyze everything through that belief. I can tell you how toothpaste is racist. Toothpaste, and normal people will go, what the fuck do you mean toothpaste is racist? How is toothpaste racist? And then you ask somebody like Ibram X. Kendi, and all of a sudden he will say like, oh, well, we value whiteness. We're jeering off. Right. But it's highlighting exactly the problem that you're doing right now.
Not. I don't think you're being very fair. Let me explain to you how I think the world works, and then you can tell me if you disagree. How I think the world works is that if the U.S. could, it would eliminate all of the states that it views as threats to the rules-based international order. The only reason it doesn't is because it can't. Now, if spontaneously some internal threat emerges in the very United States itself, and it doesn't have all the time that Iran and North Korea have to establish themselves, it is going to immediately do everything in its power to crush that. The only reason Iran, North Korea, Russia, and all these rogue countries that are opposed to U.S. hegemony even survive is because they're fucking authoritarian. They would have been killed in their cradle otherwise. So I'm trying to say there's no reason to think it won't happen. I'm asking you for one reason to think it wouldn't happen, and you can't give me anything. You're like, oh, you're just assuming this is going to happen because you're a Gnostic. I'm not assuming that because I'm a Gnostic. I'm assuming that because it seems pretty clear about how the world right now works, like right now. Like the US has always tried to invade and intervene in countries that have these revolutions and shit and destroy and economically sabotage. I mean, if you knew the extent of CIA intervention, if you knew the extent of military intervention, if you knew the extent of economic sabotage and shit, I mean, it's you would be just as paranoid, right? I don't think these things are unreasonable. I'm not a Gnostic. There's nothing to do with critical race theory. It's like, dude, if you declare war on the fucking US government, you are going to bear the full brunt of the operational capabilities of the US state to destroy you. I don't think that's Gnosticism. I don't think that's a uniquely Marxist statement whatsoever. I just think it's common sense.
Yeah, I mean, it is reasonable to predict, right, that if you attempted some form of revolution, we have no idea what that looks like, right? So we're making our first assumption, which is that the revolution is a country declaring its independence and seceding, or
Okay,
is
what
right?
what could it be?
There are so many, like, it's, you're engaging in trying to predict the future. Like it
No,
could be anything.
Listen. Do you
right?
believe in science? Do you believe in science?
I mean, I don't believe in the science, but I believe in the scientific method.
That's what I mean. So do you think
Okay.
it's possible that although we can't know with 100% certainty, we can at least try and infer things based on their likelihood?
Yeah, the problem is that you
So
can't
don't
make
you think that
moral,
applies
you
to,
can't
don't you think that
make
applies to
moral
political
decisions.
strategy?
You can't make moral decisions about what you ought do when it violates, when it is aggressive, right?
Okay,
But you
but here's the
absolutely
thing,
can,
dude.
you absolutely
But
can attempt to predict the future based off of available evidence, right?
okay. So if you're just trying to have a reason, if you have a political strategy, that means you should probably try and know what you're doing. Otherwise, if you're just dying on the hill of, oh, it's moral, reality be damned, I'm sorry, but you're not going to get anywhere, right? That's exactly the utopian socialist kind of moralistic view that Marx and Engels derided for so long. It's like, look, I'm a Marxist. I know you might think that this is based in like some fundamental Gnosticism. It's like, the truth is, dude, I'm not really that, unless you're like some like huge creep or like freak, which you don't seem like it. I'm not really that different from you. I'm not different from
Mhm.
you or any of those Ron Paul people either. I know there's a fucking establishment. I hate them. You hate them. I know this is a status quo that's not just, right? I know that there's people in power that are fucking us all over. I am dying on the hill that communism is the most effective theory to fight back, right? And
But
one of
why?
the
I don't understand that.
because
how many times must it fail to do that
because I understand
before your belief in
because I
empiricism
understand.
as a means of moving
Sure.
forward justifies, even from your own, like, doing an internal critique here, right? So I'm stepping into your, I'm stepping into.
Because communist societies have been the most effective at pursuing a path of modernization independent from the global hegemony, independent from the powers that were at the time. They were the most effective at fending off the infiltration of the ruling class and pursuing an alternative path of modernity.
But they didn't do any of those things.
Yes, they did. Yes, they did.
No, they just created a new elite that and new dictatorships and new death and suffering against the other people, the other powers.
You can exclusively just try and focus on all of the points in which the communist dictatorship had to assert itself and prevail over its adversaries, which obviously took a very ugly form. But when it wasn't doing that, when it was just people living their life normally, because life did proceed normally in communism, what you had was the closest thing to your anarcho-capitalist dream you can think of. Communities and people freely living their lives in a normal and natural way without having to be subjected to the dictatorship of a foreign, aggressive, international global hegemony that is constantly trying to find ways to pervert, subvert, harass, destroy, and exterminate them. Like, you could say the communist dictatorship was brutal, but besides defending the very dictatorship, besides defending their country against the adversary, it was pretty hands off. People could just fucking breathe and live their fucking life. That's what being a free people means. It means being able to pursue a path of modernization that reflects you and your countrymen's character.
Dude,
the
idea that there was more, the idea, hold on, I'm ready to go into closing statements. Maybe we'll talk some other time about this, but the idea that like, that life was fucking more peachy under the USSR,
not
right?
PG.
Is peachy as Peachy.
That's how they describe it. People from the USSR describe it. Dude, you have to understand, the USSR was a bad place for these like cosmopolitan, airy-fairy intellectuals who loved the West and wanted to be Western liberals. But if you're an ordinary person living in the USSR, I actually think peachy, especially if we're talking about the 60s and 70s, peachy is a pretty good word to describe it. It wasn't always great. You didn't always have all the access to luxury goods, but I think people were happy. And I don't think that's really that disputed among people who know anything about the communist experience for the average person. Go talk to Russians and ask them, was your life happy under the USSR? And they'll be like, yeah, it was. It was happy, normal, and healthy. See, you had excesses of the state that were grotesque and abnormal, but they're extremely small exceptions. But capitalist society is one big continuous abnormality. Now, you don't think it's capitalism. You think it's some kind of statism or whatever. And I'm not here to argue with you about the terms, right? But what we have in the US, West Germany, and elsewhere, although there's more access to luxury goods, it is one continuous stream of unnatural, grotesque abnormality, constantly trying to subvert and undermine people's basic sensibilities, prostitution, pornography, drugs, the breakdown of the family, the breakdown and destruction of communities. People in the USSR, if you could fault them for anything, fault them for being too comfortable. Fault them for being too complacent in their actual happy social communal lives and not doing what the Maoists did in China, which is like shake things up and have a totally, youthful rebellion of the Red Guards, which was actually socially destructive at the time, but seems like it saved China.
Okay.
So, the thing is, people think communism. My closing statement is this, and I'll let you do a closing statement, right?
Right.
People view communism as this like constant form of aggression by the state against its own citizens. But the truth is that aggression confined itself to a small set of exceptions that were almost entirely defined by those who wanted to, for whatever reason, overthrow communism itself because they thought liberalism was better or because they were serving foreign powers. For the overwhelming majority of people who were living in communism, again, there's small periods of exceptions, like the horrible famine in the 30s and the one during the Great Leap Forward was a horrible disaster, right? So there's these exceptions there. But for the most part, life is pretty good and pretty happy for most people. And it's not an aggressive state. It's a hands-off state that's leaving people alone and letting them associate and do the things that actually reflect their character as a people. People can breathe. So that's my closing statement. It's more libertarian. Yeah. That's what it is.
Yeah, all right. So hold on, I'm getting picked up by your mic.
I'll shut it off.
Yeah. So in closing, look, this was a wild conversation for sure. I had fun. It was a good conversation. I think more of these need to happen more. And I tried to go in for a debate, but it doesn't look like we did a whole lot of debating about communism. More about our views of the world and how things work. The problem that I have, right, is that often I talk to communists and they will see problems many ways the same way that libertarians see problems. Or maybe you could say that we see problems in much the same way that the communists see them, being the fact that the communism was there first. But nevertheless, this analysis is always one-sided. It's one vein. It's not an analysis about, it's an analysis from this domain that there is class warfare, there is power, there is struggle. This is everything. This is how we view the world. This is the dominant thing that must take part. and the collective whole is better than the individual will, because the individual will is not capable in a pragmatic reality of dealing with the external problems that threaten the collective. And I understand that knee-jerk reaction, but when you really drill communism down, what you get to is you get a moral justification for the worst atrocities that have ever existed in human history. You morally justify anything in the name of fighting these other evil entities. You know, they'll call it capitalism. I would call it capitalistic with a mixed market economy. Sometimes I even call it fascistic, because it is not a free market capitalist society. And so they say, well, it's okay to starve our people in one way, or it's okay to give up rights in another way, because it's for the collective whole. It's for everybody that we restrict their rights, we restrict their freedoms, we exert dictatorial power and pressure on these people as a means of stopping this greater evil. Communism really, as described by Has, is picking the lesser of two evils over and over and over again until you're in the worst circumstances imaginable and calling it a moral victory. You have to start at the baseline of understanding what is right and what is wrong. Do you own your own labor? Do you have bodily autonomy? The communist says no, whilst speaking out of one corner of their mouth, and it says that only the communist society is where individuals own their own labor, except you're not allowed to voluntarily sell your labor, so you can't sell it. And, there's labor theory of value, and there's one in Das Kapital 1, and then there's a second one in Das Kapital 3, and then there's, all these other forms to try and deal with all of the things that they have been proven wrong over and over and over again. The marginal revolution in economics should have destroyed Marxism as an economic theory of having any seat at the table, but it doesn't, because it's persuasive. It sounds nice. It's, as Nietzsche put it, it's ressentiment, but the way that it's sold is empathy, care, community, all of these things that the libertarian also wants. These are things that are universal to humans. They all want a community. They all want health. They all want happiness. They all want to be able to live in a better family. Nobody really fucking wants the nuclear family or the single mom. Like, we all want to live in a community of people that work together and fight these things. But when you drill down the economic parts and you drill down the philosophy, you eventually get to, I deny existence. You eventually get to, oh, well, we'll just have a supercomputer solve it. When you get towards actually solving problems and actually dealing with reality, all the Marxists can offer you is a belief in class power and class struggle that sometimes is an appropriate lens. But it's not enough in terms of being able to view history. It poisons their ability to be able to accurately look at reality, and it destroys the very people that it promotes that it's going to save. The lesser of two evils is choosing evil. So don't choose evil. Be a libertarian, because why would you choose evil? Like, I'll leave it there.
All right. Well, it was a good discussion. We should have it again. So yeah.
All right. It was nice talking to you. I gotta get out of here, and I gotta fucking eat.
Yep.
I got half an hour to eat. All right. You have a good one. And also, ACAB, all cops are bastards. Fuck the police for pulling you over. We had a good conversation regardless.
Appreciate it, man. Thanks. See you later.
All right. Peace.